After 2 smash hits on the Sega Genesis and a Sega CD sequel on its way, Sonic Mania was in full effect. Quickly after Sonic 2 released, yet another Sega Genesis sequel was greenlit in Sonic 3. And this is the game where some of my fondest Sonic memories come from. Sonic 3 was initially meant to be larger and grander. That would eventually come thanks to a unique attachment via Sonic and Knuckles. But for this video, I'm going to focus on Sonic 3 as it released, because I find that interesting. While Sonic collections today combine the two games, that's not how people actually experienced it upon release, and I want to look at how the compromise would affect the actual released Sonic 3. So I hope you'll join me on this deep dive into Sonic 3. For those of you just joining me, this is my 4th video in the classic Sonic series, so I won't be going over mechanics I already discussed in my previous videos unless there was a change. Before hopping into game design, let's talk about the development history that would lead into the creation of Sonic 3. While Sonic 2 took a surprising amount of time after the release of Sonic 1 to get the full green light from Sega, after Sonic 2 was released in November of 1992, it would only be a couple months later in January of 1993 that Sonic 3 would be greenlit, once again with Sega Technical Institute, or STI, taking the reins. However, while Sonic 2 was developed in collaboration between Japanese and American staff members, that would change for Sonic 3. In an interview translated by Shmuplations, according to Yuji Naka, Sega wanted to make sure it didn't lose its employees, so they brought me back to Japan. Tails designer Yasushi Yamaguchi also came back, and we needed to assemble a new staff once again. At the end of the Sonic 2 development, we had a hell of a time coordinating with the American staff, and for that reason, for Sonic 3, we decided to make Sonic 3 with an all-Japanese team. From the American side, it sounds like they perceived Yuji Naka as difficult to work with, whereas the Japanese were viewed as the more superior and mentor team, so it's possible Yuji Naka didn't want to deal with more junior team members who were difficult to communicate with through language barriers. According to Mark Cerny, who was then the head of STI, due to visa issues, the Sonic 2 team, at least initially, primarily comprised of American developers over Japanese developers. It created challenges when trying to create a game that needed to hit the quality level of Sonic 2. This was made worse by language issues and cultural issues. The Japanese and American staff could barely talk to each other, and though I was hoping a mentor-mentee relationship would develop between the more senior Japanese members and junior American members, it never happened. Craig Stitt, a zone artist on Sonic 2, explained from his point of view, "To be honest, we had good times and a lot of not-so-good times. I don't think there was a lot of learning going on for the most part. Yasuhara was an easy person to work with, and I never felt he looked down on the Americans on the team. Yamaguchi was also easy to work with. On the other hand, Naka was an arrogant pain in the ass. He had no interest in working with any of the Americans." Either way, it would result in Yuji Naka getting his wish, and Sonic 3 being developed almost exclusively by a fully Japanese team. Yuji Naka and Hirokazu Yasuhara seem to be the primary leads, with Hirokazu Yasuhara being the planner on both Sonics 1 and 2, and someone who I attribute a lot of the excellent game design to. For Sonic 3, Hirokazu Yasuhara is credited as both the director and the lead game designer. In a fascinating twist, Sonic 3 was originally planned to be completely different than the Sonic 3 we know today. In fact, it seems roughly half of its development time was used for a prototype that would never see the light of day and was completely scrapped. This was all due to an in-development chip for the Sega Genesis that would bring all new technical upgrades for the game that used it. From Yuji Naka, "I heard talk of a new virtual processing chip, the SVP, to be used in Virtua Racing. Then we started talking about using that in Sonic 3. Up until about June of 1993, the Sonic 3 development included the SVP. It featured isometric 3D graphics, and you could rotate and turn the game field. Unfortunately, in June, we realized that development of the SVP chip probably wouldn't be finished by the end of the year, so we abandoned all the programming and work we'd done up to then. In the remaining 6 months we had for Sonic 3, we had to start entirely from zero and redo everything. We had all these different ideas: screen rotation, globe-shaped levels, hidden areas. Sonic 3D Blast, released late into 1996, would utilize a 3D isometric view and could very well be, visually, what Sonic 3 was shaping up to be. However, I'm not entirely sure how much inspiration its gameplay or visuals Sonic 3D Blast took from that Sonic 3 prototype. Sonic 3D Blast was made in coordination between Sonic Team and Traveler's Tales, who did the programming. It is possible, especially considering there were some Sonic 3 members who worked on Sonic 3D Blast, such as Hirokazu Yasuhara and Takashi Iizuka, but again, as far as I can tell, to what extent is entirely speculation. Either way, that idea was dropped for Sonic 3, and the team had essentially erased half of their development time, meaning some drastic cuts would have to be made as they returned to the standard Sonic 2D gameplay with far less time on their hands. Even so, the team had grandiose ideas for what they wanted out of Sonic 3. Takashi Iizuka says, "We wanted to make Sonic 3 more epic than Sonic 2. Specifically, that meant strengthening the story elements, adding uniqueness to the Act 1 and 2 pairs, adding new playable characters, expanding each stage, adding new routes for each character, and enhancing two-player versus play." The stages ballooned in size. Acts 1 and 2 of each stage had different music, art, and sometimes gameplay beats, and mini-bosses were put at the end of Act 1. For the storytelling, brief in-game cutscenes were added throughout. As Yuji Naka tells it, the team ran out of time, and possibly space as well, to add everything they wanted into the game. He says, "Unfortunately, having to restart everything in June, we only had time to create about half the stages we'd envisioned. Then, at the very end of the Sonic 3 development, we were talking about needing to do something, and someone asked if it would be technically possible to combine two cartridges. We figured out the way to do that at the very, very last minute before the deadline, and then we revised all the programming in Sonic 3 to account for a future lock-on cart. That lock-on cart is, of course, Sonic and Knuckles, which, when combined with Sonic 3, creates a full experience and the intended single game. Something I find fascinating about all of this, as it pertains to Sonic 3 specifically, was how the team chose which stages would be meant for Sonic 3. Because it seems like for a time, they didn't think the larger Sonic 3 Knuckles would be possible, and were making drastic cuts, probably using their best and favorite ideas, I'd imagine, for Sonic 3 specifically. Takashi Iizuka states, "I would say that, when the SVP development was finally determined to be a no-go, we weren't plunged into despair. Each time the SVP development got delayed, it helped narrow the scope of what we were doing with Sonic 3, which was helpful." One more thing I'd like to note about the development of Sonic 3 is that as it began development January 1993, I highly doubt there was any influence from the upcoming Sonic CD. Sonic CD released fall of 1993, with a different month depending on the region, and Sonic 3's true non-3D development began before then in June 1993, with its release date being February 1994 to North America and Europe. So the fact that Sonic CD was in development during both Sonic 2 and Sonic 3 is probably another reason why Sonic CD exists in a bit of a vacuum. Boot up Sonic 3, and players will be greeted by a 3D Sonic leaping into his emblem before the title rises into place. In both Sonic 1 and Sonic CD, this title screen was used as a bit of a graphical showcase. Sonic 1 used this to show off its multiple parallax effects, evoking a sense of speed, but also something the Sega Genesis could do that was incredibly difficult and limited on both the Sega Master System and the NES. Sonic CD imitated a 3D rendering of Sonic, while also using something unique to the Sega CD that the Sega Genesis couldn't pull off. The clouds are scrolling using a type of scaling similar to the Super Nintendo's Mode 7. While the SNES could do this type of scaling, the Sega Genesis couldn't, So it did make this another example of showcasing new technology to wow players right from the get-go. Sonic 2, though, has a much more subdued title screen with far less parallax effects, and instead used the emblem to show off the brand new character of Tails and have a nice clean visual. So for Sonic 3, the faux 3D visual effect that was used for both Sonic and his emblem, again, was likely to try and showcase a technological leap. It's meant as a wow moment to impress players right off the bat. While I did play Sonic 3 when it first came out, I honestly don't remember my thoughts on this emblem at the time. I'm sure I thought it was cool, although my thoughts differ nowadays. I honestly don't think this 3D holds up as well as Sonic 1 or 2's emblems, which look really clean and include incredible sprite work. Sonic 2's emblem is my personal favorite, as I happen to really like how Sonic looks in that one. On another note, I'm bouncing back and forth between my footage I recorded from one of my playthroughs on the Sega Genesis, as well as my Sonic Origins footage, which is automatically Sonic 3 and Knuckles. The reason being, even though I tried recording from my Sega Genesis at high quality, it still doesn't look nearly as good as the HD Sonic Origins footage. To keep dissecting this title screen further, even with this 3D Sonic, the team still attempted to give him the feeling of attitude by having him wag his finger at players, just like how he did in Sonic 1, and also wink at players. Again, I think this 3D model doesn't have the same cool meets cute look of the Sonic 1 emblem animation, but I get that, at the time, this was meant to be something incredibly impressive. While we don't get the same sense of speed and movement in the title screen via parallax scrolling, there still is a subtle effect in the water. However, this is one that might be slightly different in Sonic Origins from Sonic 3. In Sonic 3, it looks like the water lines are animated to move every now and then to create a water rippling effect. However, in the Sonic Origins version of the title screen, the water has parallax layers throughout, with them subtly moving back and forth to really accentuate that water rippling effect. I really like this water effect in Sonic Origins, and I think it acts as a nice accent to what was intended in the original version of Sonic 3. But again, I'm fairly certain this parallax effect in the water wasn't actually in the original version of Sonic 3. Finally, we see Angel Island in the background, and Tails fly by on his plane. It's a nice title screen that shows off where we are going to go, with another beautiful vista and Sonic front and center. But if I'm being honest, I prefer the titles to both Sonic 2 and Sonic 1. Sonic 1 has that fantastic sense of speed with the parallax scrolling, and Sonic and his emblem truly exudes attitude and cuteness. Sonic 2 takes the crown as my personal favorite, as not only do I love the updated style of Sonic and inclusion of Tails in the emblem, but I love how much cleaner this title feels. Because the Sonic 3 emblem is so big, it makes the title screen feel pretty crammed to me, whereas Sonic 2 feels the cleanest. Players will have the option to choose one player or competition. We'll come back to competition later, so let's click into one player and you'll be greeted by a brand new screen for the Sonic series, a data select. While I had some nitpicks about the Sonic 3 title, this is going to be where I gush, so if you'll allow me. Unlike Sonic's 1 and 2, and a nice quality of life change, Sonic 3 now allows players to create a save file, with the game automatically saving as they make progress. Sonic CD was the first Sonic game to allow for this, however, players only had one active save file immediately working. If they wanted to create new saves, they need to go into their RAM data and copy files around. As with CDs, the CD didn't actually store any data, but rather the Sega CD itself had a small amount of internal storage available. As space was so limited, this was likely why players only had one save slot. Although, technically you could use the RAM data to create more. With Sonic 3, or any cartridge game for that matter, the save data is a part of the cartridge itself. Typically, to allow for saving, an internal battery needs to be added to the cartridge itself, which is a little more expensive to manufacture, and hence a major reason many publishers opted out of this in favor of a password system, even after saving slowly became more standard. So all of that is to say, as Sonic 3 is on a cartridge, the team opted to allow for enough space for not just one save file, but up to 6 save slots in Sonic 3. I can't say for certain, but perhaps not putting the Sonic and Knuckles content all into the Sonic 3 cartridge freed up some extra space for things like the save system, or extra bells and whistles in the graphics, music, and sound effects that otherwise wouldn't have existed had the entire game been crammed into one cartridge. The 6-save system works particularly well for Sonic 3, considering not only is it likely siblings and or friends will be playing together on the same cartridge, and therefore want multiple slots, but like Sonic 2, players can choose to play as Sonic, Tails, or Sonic and Tails, meaning if one of those people want to 100% the game with all 3 characters, they'd be using up 3 save slots right then and there. The UI for the save system is extremely clean, with each save slot taking up a vertical bar, and players able to quickly assess at a glance which save file they might want to choose. Each save file includes the character who was chosen for the playthrough front and center, the current level the player is on, and how many Chaos Emeralds they've collected. In an additional nice touch, an image of the current stage that player is on will appear, and if the player has beaten the game 100% with all Chaos Emeralds, an image of Super Sonic will take its place. It's clear and concise, and immediately presents all of the information a player truly needs to know. Because it shows how many Chaos Emeralds the player has collected front and center, that really helps to highlight their importance, especially for a player who might have somehow not figured that out after the intro to Sonic 3 that features them. If players have a new save file, it's immediately obvious thanks to arrows that they can press up or down to cycle which character to play as, once again presenting its choice in a universal language that's clear without taking up any additional UI bandwidth. If a file contains a completed game, players can instead use up and down to replay any stage they want. As there are limited save slots, in an added nice touch, players can go to the top left of the file select to play through the game without creating a save file. I'm sure there are some players out there, however limited, who feel a save system somehow detracts from the overall Sonic experience. I don't agree with that idea, but hey, Sega's got you. But more importantly, it does serve as a safety net for that use case where every save slot is taken, but someone still wants to play the game without interrupting or deleting a save. Finally, go to the far right, and you'll see Dr. Robotnik giving players the ability to delete a save. Select him, and you can then bring him over to any save you want to delete it. And a nice safety catch, if players do choose to delete a save, the game asks one more time if you're sure, yes or no. That safety check is pretty standard, but it's still nice to see, especially in a game a lot of young kids will be playing who might not fully grasp what that option is going to do. The entire functionality of needing to choose delete, then re-choose the save, then choose yes or no, absolutely ensures that this potentially major decision is a deliberate choice. But even beyond that, this is one of the most creative file deletion systems I think I've seen, even still. It makes sense from a story standpoint that Robotnik would be the one who would want to delete Sonic's save data, and creates for a fun visual beyond some generic text. And again, for any players young enough who might not be able to read, they'll still probably know Robotnik is bad, so choosing him means it's a bad option. All around, this file select is absolutely fantastic. It takes what could be a quick and boring bit of necessary UI, makes it visually appealing, adds some incredible music to the data select, and ensure that everything was as clear and user-friendly as possible without feeling cluttered. Click into Sonic 3, and yet another major changeup will happen immediately. An introductory in-game cutscene. Sonic and Tails are flying into Angel Island, for whatever reason, when Sonic jumps off and transforms into Super Sonic. He speeds ahead into the jungle of the island before Knuckles pops out of the ground, steals Sonic's Chaos Emeralds, and runs off. This is all of the context that the game itself gives players, so if you want more context, you'll need to flip open the manual. As it turns out, at the end of Sonic 2, after Sonic destroyed the Death Egg, Robotnik and his Death Egg crash-landed on the floating Angel Island. Robotnik learns the island is floating due to the power of the Chaos Emeralds, and tricks Knuckles into thinking Sonic and Tails are coming to steal the Emeralds, while he himself works to take them for his own devious purposes. So, Sonic 3 is a direct storyline progression from Sonic 2, and it seems Sonic and Tails are flying to Angel Island to continue their quest of stopping Robotnik. However, this isn't exactly correct, because, as per usual with the Sonic games, the English manual translation takes liberties from the Japanese manual, although it's basically accurate. Within the Japanese manual, you'll learn that when the Death Egg struck the flying Angel Island, it crashed Angel Island to the Earth. Not only that, but Sonic and Tails didn't directly go to Angel Island. Rather, Tails invented a jewel radar to detect Chaos Emeralds, with this idea likely inspired by the Dragon Radar that detects Dragon Balls from Dragon Ball. After detecting a powerful Chaos Emerald signal, the two head off to investigate. There's also some background lore about the island itself, which, legend has it, was inhabited by a peaceful and prosperous ancient superior civilization who utilized the energy of a Power Stone. But after a group of elders tried to harness that energy for themselves, the energy ran wild and instantly wiped out the civilization. Not only that, but we get further insight into Knuckles. Knuckles is the guardian of the Chaos Emeralds. However, when the Death Egg crashes into Angel Island, the Chaos Emerald altar has been half destroyed, and the Chaos Emeralds that were supposed to be there are missing. When he spots the crashed Death Egg, he believes it's an egg depicted from a legend on the altar of the Chaos Emeralds that's meant to bring misfortune. Continuing his search for the Chaos Emeralds, he comes across Dr. Robotnik. Robotnik claims to be a scientist investigating the egg. He then lies to Knuckles that Sonic is an evil hedgehog interfering with his research and after the Chaos Emeralds. Knuckles is gullible and easily believes the lie. As I've been showing with footage, the essence of this story was nicely animated for Sonic Origins, and I think it's nice to have that added context within the game itself. When I first played Sonic 3, I didn't read the manual for the story, so I had no idea who Knuckles was or why he was antagonizing Sonic throughout Sonic 3. That does eventually mostly make sense, and did click with me once Sonic and Knuckles was added on through its in-game storytelling. So I suppose that does lead to a question with the original Sonic 3, and that's if any more context should have been provided within the game. At the time, games could include more in-game story with cutscenes that would oftentimes play if players waited long enough during the title screen. Ninja Gaiden is perhaps one of the most famous versions of this, because of how incredible it handled its introductory cutscene. Sonic CD also included an introductory animated sequence that would only play, in the original Sega CD version of Sonic CD, if players waited long enough during the title screen. That introduction in Sonic CD not only has incredible visuals and animations, but also provides the extra context as to why Sonic is on Little Planet. The later Sonic 3D Blast would also include the very type of introductory cutscene I'm talking about, with comic book style storytelling to help explain the story before players set off. I don't think Sonic 3 needs this, and it is nice that if players enter the game, it immediately gets going. The story isn't really that important, I'd think, to most players of Sonic 3, and there's enough in-game cutscenes to get the idea of what's going on, so it really comes down to a preference thing. Like I said, I like the added animated sequence and context from Sonic Origins. So that says, to me, that maybe I would have liked if there was a brief paneled cutscene if players held on the title screen long enough to add some additional context without needing to open the manual. Although anything like that in an early console game, like the Sega Genesis, automatically might bring with it space issues and compromises. So it is worth noting that, even if that might have been a nice touch, it could have led to compromises elsewhere in the game that would have made other elements worse and therefore not worth it. Coming back to the intro itself, it's a nice touch overall. For starters, as the intro begins with Sonic and Tails flying at high speed, and then Super Sonic rushing forward at blazing speed, it immediately instills that fun sense of action and speed to players before they even touch the controller. This is what Sonic is and can be, and that's a really cool feeling. On top of that, it nicely introduces Super Sonic without needing to over-explain. While Super Sonic was introduced in Sonic 2, it's definitely possible that certain players never discovered Super Sonic, or other players who are brand new to Sonic 3 will have no idea that there is such a thing as Super Sonic. So here, not only are you non-verbally shown Super Sonic's power and speed as he blasts forwards faster than an airplane, flying over water, as soon as he's knocked over by Knuckles who takes the Chaos Emeralds, you're shown exactly what Sonic needed in order to use the Super Sonic ability. Without needing a tutorial or guide, the game has efficiently shown you exactly what you need for this great supersonic power. Similar to the file select screen, it's simple and a matter of show don't tell. When players do eventually find bonus stages and gather a Chaos Emerald, it should now immediately click that this is one of the things that Sonic lost when he was Supersonic, so maybe if you collect more, you can become Supersonic. And that's only further reinforced by the file select showcasing Chaos Emeralds collected for each file. It also nicely introduces the antagonist of Knuckles. He doesn't attack players, but only takes the Chaos Emeralds. So even if you haven't read the game manual, it's clear that he's probably not all bad, because otherwise he would have actively attacked Sonic and began fighting him. So really, a great start to Sonic 3. I like that all of this is done in-game rather than through an animated or panel cutscene, because it's nice to see the mechanics of the game itself used for storytelling. And speaking of game mechanics, let's go over some of the changes to Sonic's mechanics that Sonic 3 would introduce. As far as Sonic's base mechanics are concerned, as far as I'm aware, he controls identical to Sonic from Sonic 2. That means the speed cap issue that was present in Sonic 1, where players hit a bumper and shoot at a faster speed than Sonic's normal max running speed, then press forward on the controller and are instantly reverted back to Sonic's max run speed, is no longer present, as that speed cap was removed in Sonic 2. While Sonic CD introduced the super peel out to Sonic's moveset, with Sonic being able to instantly accelerate to max running speed without needing to roll, this isn't present in Sonic 3. This could be due to a number of factors, such as Sonic CD and Sonic 3 being concurrently in development for a time, thus the move didn't exist during a large portion of Sonic 3's development. It could also be a simple developer choice due to how functionally similar the two moves are. If you want a much more in-depth discussion of the super peel out though, I'd refer you back to my Sonic CD video. Sonic CD also changed the way the spin dash functioned. Whereas Sonic 2 had players rev up the spin dash, Sonic CD had players press the button combination for the spin dash or super peel out, then wait for a certain period of time and let go. There was no controlling the speed, a la the revving up of Sonic 2. Modern versions of Sonic CD change this, so even if you're playing the classic Sonic CD method, you can still somewhat control your speed of the spin dash or super peel out by letting go of the button early. Once again, like any innovation from Sonic CD, Sonic 3 ignores the Sonic CD version and utilizes the revving of Sonic 2 for its spin dash, which I honestly think plays and feels better. Finally, one more thing introduced in Sonic CD that was dropped for Sonic 3 is its dynamic camera. In Sonic CD, when Sonic picks up speed, the camera will adjust to allow players to see more in front of them, making running at high speeds feel slightly more fair, although it did have minor issues for when players would suddenly switch directions. Either way, this dynamic camera isn't present in Sonic 3. I'm not sure if this was a specific choice, or something the Sonic team working on Sonics 2 and 3 never considered. The lack of it could have also been a limitation of the Sega Genesis hardware compared to the Sega CD hardware. So all of this is a long-winded way to say, mechanically speaking, nothing new or notable from Sonic CD carries over to Sonic 3. They were developed by entirely different teams, and for a time in development at the same time, so that's not surprising. From a basic mechanic standpoint, Sonic 3 is content to carry over everything from Sonic 2, which makes sense because the game feels fantastic, which is part of why Sonic became such a beloved game franchise in the first place. One more basic mechanic note before moving on is something I actually missed in my Sonic 2 video. I was talking about the Sonic CD camera and how it pans in order for players to see in front of them, but I missed that the Sonic 2 camera actually changes its functionality slightly for a spin dash. When players begin a spin dash, the camera locks in place. This isn't noticeable because the player isn't moving, but when the player lets go of the spin dash, the camera doesn't begin moving again until the player is near the edge of the screen. At that point, it will rapidly catch up in order to recenter Sonic in the middle of the screen. While Sonic CD's camera pans forwards while a player is charging up both the super peel out and spin dash in order to allow players to see further in front of them, this is almost the opposite, as players are prevented from seeing directly in front of them for a brief moment. If I had to guess, this was probably done in order to make the spin dash feel that much faster. It's such a fast and speedy move, with so much instant acceleration, Sonic is blasting off the side of the screen, briefly, and to the point where the team still tried to make it fair by quickly recentering Sonic. So, which method is better? Sonic CD is made from the standpoint of player fairness. Sonic 2 and 3 is made from the standpoint of game feel. In my head, I think, oh, well, Sonic CD's has to be better because it's the more fair one. But I honestly never noticed this spin dash camera quirk until writing this video, even though I've been talking about cameras throughout the entire series. So clearly, it was so subtle to me, I never clocked it as feeling unfair, and I always thought the spin dash felt fun to perform. While working on my Sonic CD video, I actually wondered something. In Sonic Origins, you're allowed to choose between the classic Sonic CD mode for a spin dash and Super Peel Out, or the Sonic/3 version for a spin dash, with the Super Peel Out acting the same way. If you choose the Sonic 2/3 version, the camera will never track ahead of players, ever. This only happens in the Sonic CD version of the controls. And I wasn't sure exactly why. Why not give players the Sonic 2/3 version of the spin dash, but still give that cool Sonic CD camera movement? And I think this must be why. If the game pauses the camera for a moment before it rapidly catches up to recenter Sonic for the way Sonic 2 and 3 spin dash functions, to help with its game feel, I imagine if the camera was whipping all the way in front of Sonic, it might feel way too jarring and like too much camera movement. That does make me wonder if there's a Sonic game I'm not aware of that does both, because I am curious how combining the two camera systems would work. As it stands though, I think I prefer this game feel version of Sonic's 2 and 3, but that could just be my bias from preferring how the spin dash itself functions in terms of its game mechanics. Where Sonic 3 differs from Sonic 2 is with certain added abilities. The first of these is in the Insta-Shield, which is an ability Sonic can use at any point when he doesn't have a different shield upgrade attached. If players press the jump button while in midair, Sonic will activate his Insta-Shield, which will both increase his attack hitbox and even give Sonic temporary invincibility frames, or iframes for short. According to Sonic Retro's physics guide, which is an absolutely fantastic guide to all things Sonic mechanics, and I highly recommend perusing if you're interested in all of the specifics or plan to make a fan game, Sonic's hitbox expands to a radii of 24 and lasts for 14 frames, which is actually longer than the visual animation of the Insta-Shield, which only lasts for 6 frames. The player has invincibility for the entire duration of the Insta-Shield. The extra length of the Insta-Shield, with it lasting longer than the animation, is one of those things developers do to help ensure the game feels fair. Typically, when it comes to hitboxes or ways players can get injured, you want to err on the side of giving the players the benefit of the doubt. If a player thinks they were supposed to hurt an enemy or have invincibility frames but get injured anyways, that's when they'll start to get frustrated or think a game feels unfair. So while you could certainly do exactly as the visual indicates, it's not a bad idea to give players a slight leeway to ensure it feels fair. As far as the Insta-Shield works with the actual gameplay, it's an additional tool at the player's disposal. So to that end, that means it's another thing the designers are going to have to consider and design around. It's a more advanced tactic, even though it's still fairly basic. So how much do you design around this, and do you ever require players know this tactic and need to use it? Sonic 3's answer seems to be that players never technically need this mechanic and can entirely beat the game without ever using it. However, there are certain enemies who the mechanic seems intended to use against, as they have dangerous shields players can avoid by utilizing the Insta-Shield. It also allows skilled players to more easily avoid damage and fly through stages even faster with proper Insta-Shield usage and timing. That does mean that this can make Sonic 3 easier than the other Sonic games through Insta-Shield alone, but the Sonic series are games that are obstacle heavy, and this isn't going to protect players from every obstacle and situation, and in particular, from being crushed by something. While the Insta-Shield can be abused from the standpoint of trivializing many enemies in the game, it does take a level of skill and mastery to get to that point. So much so, I think if anything, it raises the skill cap to Sonic 3, while also giving average players another tool that feels like it can help in a pinch or against very specific enemies. I don't think I ever realized this could be abused or thought about it as an iframe tool, and mainly thought about it as an offensive tool to help me attack specific enemies. But this tool, on its own, might change your overall opinion of Sonic 3, or how you like to think of a Sonic game, because we have a new offensive addition to Sonic's arsenal per each game. Sonic 1 is the most pure in that sense, where it's simply about momentum-based running. Sonic 2 then added the Spin Dash, which gives players an instant acceleration boost, but could also be used offensively. And now, the Insta-Shield gives players another way to easily clear through enemies while in the air. Something I'm always thinking about with the moveset to the game I'm working on, and I'm sure the Sonic team had it in mind too, is how easily can each move the player has in their arsenal be used to trivialize or break intended challenges, and from there, how difficult is it to do so? The way I think about things is, it's okay for advanced players to be able to break intended challenges in interesting ways, because they've built up the skill set to do so through playing the game enough. It shows a level of mastery that most players won't be achieving or striving for. But hopefully, the intended challenge sequences still exist as they're intended for most players, and people playing the game for the first time. If anything, I think that level of mastery in speedrunning can add to the replayability of a game. So when it comes to the Insta-Shield, I happen to think that Insta-Shield succeeds in cradling that line where I don't think this is going to be breaking any of the gameplay or challenges for most players, and only the most dedicated and advanced will be able to use the tool in a more meaningful way. It also helps keep a flow state to Sonic 3, where players can keep their momentum and forward progress going after jumping without needing to worry so much about accidentally jumping into the wrong thing, as they can use this as a last-minute save. Or there are spiked enemies who slowly attack players, where this can help players defeat them more quickly and then move on without needing to wait as long. I'm sure another reason for the Insta-Shield existing has to do with Sonic 3's introduction to shield upgrades that become far more meaningful than the normal shields of Sonic's 1, 2, and CD. Every shield Sonic can obtain has a special ability by pressing the jump button in the air, so in order to be consistent with that, Sonic has his own special ability by pressing jump in the air, which was intended to be powerful, but not as powerful. And I think for most players, that does feel like the case. It's also worth noting every character in Sonic 3 has a special move by tapping the jump button in the air, so the Insta-Shield is Sonic's unique move. Tails can fly, Knuckles and Sonic and Knuckles can float and attack enemies while doing so. So Sonic gets this great offensive iframe tool that can be mastered to make players incredibly efficient, and really works towards speed, which makes sense for Sonic. So that brings me to the other major mechanics change up for Sonic 3, and that's in those various shield upgrades. Instead of one basic shield players can obtain, there are 3 different elemental shields players can find scattered about each act in Sonic 3 and within its bonus stages. These shields are the Water Shield, Fire Shield, and Lightning Shield. These drastically change up Sonic 3's gameplay. Not only do the shields protect Sonic, but they have offensive capabilities and or allow for more traversal. In some cases, like the Fire Shield, they give Sonic a genuine new offensive attack, meaning that Sonic is no longer just about running, jumping, and rolling. It's funny, in a way, because I never really thought about just how much these abilities change Sonic's gameplay, but they absolutely do. I happen to enjoy this increased roster of moves, but where do you fall? Because this could just be something that sets apart how you feel about Sonic 3 compared to the other games in the series. The first of these elemental shields is what I've always referred to as the Bubble Shield, although technically from the manual this is called the Water Shield. The Water Shield has multiple uses. When underwater, the Water Shield prevents players from drowning while players have it, as it acts like an air bubble. This functionality also works while players are supersonic. When in the air, if players press the attack button, it can be used to rocket players straight down as an offensive slam attack. Players will bounce if they hit the ground, and bounce even higher than most standard bounces if they use this on an enemy, as bounces are momentum-based, and you've given yourself a large downwards momentum. Finally, it can also deflect certain projectiles. The Water Shield is obviously ideal for using underwater, and as there's water in 4 of the 6 zones to Sonic 3, that does mean players can get good usage out of it, particularly in Stage 2, Hydrocity. Wherever people landed was the correct way to say the stage name. While the bounce functionality off of enemies can be interesting, I think it's fair to say this shield is far less useful out of the water than the other abilities, and this is probably the worst of the 3 shields to find, with it pretty much behaving like a normal shield at that point. Underwater, it can really trivialize any of the true challenges of the water portions of the stages, so long as players are playing carefully enough to not get hit once they have the bubble shield. I think this is especially true thanks to the fact that shields now deflect projectiles, which might have been a step too far in making them overpowered, as there's so much less danger when players have these shields. Although that could speak to the team perhaps trying to de-emphasize water challenges in Sonic 3. Like the water shield, the fire shield also protects Sonic from its element. If Sonic has the fire shield, he'll be protected from anything fire-related, such as Zone 1 Act 1's Fire Breath mini-boss. The Fire Breath will spew out a flamethrower attack, and if players have the fire shield, Sonic will be completely protected from it. Another major use will come later in Sonic & Knuckles, where it protects players from the lava of Lava Reef Zone. On top of its protective element, if players tap the jump button again while in the air with the fire shield, they'll rocket and attack forwards. This acts just like a bounce attack, meaning while the forward momentum of the fireball attack is active, players will destroy enemies without needing to worry about taking damage from non-spiky protected enemies. It also works as a nice air dash and can help players cross levels faster or cross normally out of reach gaps. Like the water shield, the fire shield can also be used to deflect certain projectiles. One note about the fire shield, though, is that if players enter water while the shield is active, the water will immediately take away the shield, because, you know, water extinguishes fire. So that actually makes water a bit of an obstacle when using the fire shield, which is a nice touch. The fire shield alters gameplay the most of any of the shields in Sonic 3, as it adds an air dash that also functions as a mid-air horizontal attack. This shield also allows players to rush through certain stages without running, as it acts as such a major momentum boost. It's such a huge momentum boost in midair, I think it actually beats out the horizontal speed of spin dash jumping, meaning players will be able to reach platforms that would be otherwise inaccessible without it. That creates a paradigm shift within the level design, because suddenly, you have a tool that can be used to sequence break certain challenges if levels are open enough. That brings me to the third elemental shield, the Lightning Shield. Like the Fire Shield and Water Shield, the Lightning Shield also deflects certain projectiles and can protect against its element of electricity. This comes especially in handy in stages from Sonic & Knuckles, like Death Egg Zone, where there are plenty of electric obstacles. Like the Fire Shield, water will immediately extinguish the Lightning Shield. Its two main functions are to attract rings to Sonic and to give Sonic a double jump. The fact that it attracts rings to the player makes it perfect for all things supersonic, as not only can it help bring players closer to that goal faster, but this functionality also stays intact while Sonic is supersonic, helping players stay in that state longer. The double jump acts just like the name implies, helping Sonic to reach all new platforms that would otherwise be out of reach. And like the Fire Shield, that means that players might be able to sequence break certain intended routes depending on the level design. Fundamentally, the elemental shields shift Sonic 3's level design and game design. For starters, they act as fantastic shields, better than the normal shield of Sonic's 1, 2, and CD, by virtue of also protecting players from certain projectiles. To me, the fact that the shields do protect against projectiles speaks to the mindset of the dev team. It says that the developers not only assumed players would be getting these shields and frequently using them, but they were helping encourage players to keep and maintain these shields. It means the team was actively designing around the idea that players would have these, because again, they were doing various things to ensure players got to keep the shields. The extra capabilities of the shields meant that losing them was far more consequential than losing a normal shield, so you're given a little more leeway. The shields all have unique offensive and traversal mechanics, but the player is only limited to having one at a time. And again, it's something they can lose. So, in a way, it's a little bit like the various powers Mario can obtain in the Mario games. Because the players can only have one at a time, with a unique moveset attached to each one, that helps to ensure that they're all balanced within each other, with each one having a unique strength. Additionally, it keeps everything simple from a control scheme standpoint. If players had the functionality of all of the shields at once, that would rapidly expand how many buttons on the controller they need to use and understand, whereas in this method, players only need the D-pad and an action button. All of that is to say, I think it was a smart decision on the team's end to handle the shields like this, Because they're a true reward to find, they all have unique situational strengths, and losing the shield feels truly consequential, but because they guard against basic projectiles, losing a shield should always feel like the player's fault. Small projectiles would be anyways, but they're harder to spot, so that could be another reason why the shields deflect them. From an offensive standpoint, I don't think the shields were really accounted for. The water shield works as a slam attack, but functionally, it's really no different than if players were to jump onto an enemy. The fire shield is the most unique, but other than its horizontal movement, again, it's no different than if players were to jump into an enemy from the side, because Sonic can still injure enemies that way. What the shields change the most though, as I touched on, is traversal. Because Sonic can now bounce high off of enemies on a whim with the bubble shield, jump and air dash across gaps with the fire shield, and double jump with the lightning shield, all of that is going to be something that gives players a huge advantage in traversing through the stages. So you cannot design a stage the same way as you design in Sonic's 1, 2, or CD, unless you're completely fine with players easily skipping and avoiding intended challenges with the brand new shields. So how do you design around this? Well, for one, you can increase the size of a stage, or increase the size of gaps and vertical jumps. So you might have vertical areas that are intentionally easier to get through with the lightning shield, but then other ones that are too high even for the lightning shield, meaning players will need to play into the challenge you had in mind. If there's a platform across a gap, and you don't want players to be able to reach it with the fire shield, the only thing you can do is either put a wall or obstacle between the two platforms, or you need to increase the distance to ensure even the fire shield can't make it across. Then, since you know players are going to be using these shields, you'd probably want to intentionally design areas that these shields can help reach, but on purpose, to make players feel good for figuring this out, or adding secret areas and rewards for their exploration. The point is, you're suddenly going to need to think about how Sonic interacts with and moves across these stages in a different way. It's a much more complex tool set, and I think that makes it much harder to design around. It's no longer as simple as, Sonic can run and has momentum, when do you want to limit that momentum with obstacles and walls, and when do you want to ensure players use that momentum? It's no longer as simple as adding a sudden speed burst to that. Now, you're also taking into account, what if players can double jump? But wait, what if they can't double jump? What if players can air dash? But wait, what if they can't air dash? What if they have the water shield and we place an enemy here? Are we okay with what that extra bounce height does in terms of our level design? Now, to an extent, I doubt they designed every single platform and every single scenario around every tool. I'm sure there were points where they said, this is a good challenge with no shields, and we're okay with however players can figure out how to traverse through if they do have a shield. But still, you can see how much more complex this has become thanks to the various shields. And to add to that complexity, Tails was given added functionality, being able to fly, and Knuckles, even though he was added in Sonic and Knuckles, was always intended to be a playable character, and he can climb up walls. That means there are so many different ways to traverse through Sonic 3, it's actually amazing that each one feels unique and fun. That's also probably a reason Sonic's given these elemental shield abilities. Because something I failed to mention is that, while Tails and Knuckles can get the shields, they can't use the unique jump action functionality. Because Tails' jump action functionality is reserved for flying, and Knuckles' jump action functionality is reserved for gliding. So, only Sonic can use the Insta-Shield, Bubble Bounce, Air Dash, and Double Jump. So, given the team knew there'd be so many ways for Tails and Knuckles to absolutely obliterate the traversal of the game, they had to give Sonic tools for also doing the same thing. And I do think his are the most interesting and fun to use, as they require more skill and thought. So, that brings me to Tails. While Tails was introduced in Sonic 2, functionally, other than his size and hitbox, he was a clone of Sonic. However, with the brand new jump actions introduced to Sonic 3, Tails received the unique jump action of being able to fly. This means Tails can easily avoid a huge number of challenges. However, he's also notably weaker than both Knuckles and Sonic because of this. Sonic's Insta-Shield and Shield abilities give Sonic far more offensive power than Tails. Meanwhile, even Knuckles is more offensively capable as his glide will hurt enemies. While Tails can fly, he is completely defenseless while doing so. On top of that, to balance his flight slightly, He can't fly forever, but only for a limited window of time before he gets tired and slowly falls back to the ground. It's a great addition to Sonic 3, as it personalizes the character far more than simply being a clone in every way. There might have been more interesting things you could do with Tails, like maybe he doesn't have quite the same top speed as Sonic, and therefore has to fly to make up for longer jumps. That would have made Tails feel more like an alternate mode to the game rather than a minor tweak. But while it's interesting to think about, it was still a nice decision to include him and start to vary him either way. Another thing Tails really brings about is helping to showcase just how differently levels are designed in Sonic 3 from prior Sonic games. It's something I'll touch on more in a dedicated section, but with Tails specifically, something you might notice is just how many more ceilings there are in Sonic 3 compared to the other games. Just take a look at Green Hill Zone versus Emerald Hill Zone versus Palm Tree Panic versus Angel Island Zone of Sonic 3. In those first 3 examples from the first 3 games, the stages are in these wide open fields with nothing but sky above the player. However, Angel Island Zone sees Sonic and friends within the middle of a jungle. That means almost the entire stage has a roof to it, such as treetops that Tails would fly into or Knuckles would climb into. So you can visually see how the team had to account for these gameplay changes in terms of the level structure, and even thematically where the players are. Now, to be fair, Mushroom Hill Zone of Sonic and Knuckles does have no roof, but seems more like the exception to me. As far as Tails' actual flying mechanic is concerned, from my testing, it seems like there are 2 different points to how this works, when flight is first activated, and then a different way this functions for once flight is actually activated. When the player jumps as Tails, it seems to me that hitting the action button and activating flight suddenly shifts how gravity works. It's not that it necessarily completely turns it off, but it reduces the amount of gravity affecting Tails. So, if you activate flight the moment you jump, Tails will soar up high into the sky because his initial jump power is now being amplified by the lessened gravity and the fact that his momentum hasn't dropped down too much yet. On the same token, if players activate flight near the end of Tails' jump while he's falling, they'll continue falling, and even fall quickly at the end of the jump even if the flight state has been activated. From there, once the flying state is activated for Tails, it seems to me there's a maximum boost he gets regardless of his momentum. So if you're dropping down and hit the jump action button, Tails will slowly lift up to a certain height and then start falling again. And if you're flying up with momentum, you won't lose momentum per se, but the maximum amount you can achieve is the exact same as if you were falling or hovering. The way flight works is a little goofy to me in this way, as it doesn't feel like activating flight at the start of a jump should get you the most height. It seems more natural that activating flight at the peak of your jump would be the smartest move. My only guess as to why the team did this was they didn't want players to be able to activate flight as Tails was falling at an extreme speed and so easily stop themselves. When in flight itself, this consistency works and makes sense. One more note on Tails is that he can now carry Sonic in 2-player mode and lift Sonic up to otherwise inaccessible or difficult to reach places. It's a great touch that makes 2-player co-op a little more fun in Sonic 3, as Tails now has a greater purpose. Alright, we have talked a lot about the mechanics that will guide the gameplay of Sonic 3, so let's jump into the first stage, Angel Island Zone. The first moments of these games are typically used to teach players. So what does Angel Island Zone's first moments teach us? Well, the start of the stage is partially framed for the Knuckles cutscene, but it also has a long runway of mini-hills that should instantly teach players how Sonic's acceleration and deceleration works when running, as well as that slopes are going to be a major factor of the Sonic games, because even in what would otherwise be a flat field, they are everywhere here. Make it past this, and players are immediately shown easy to obtain rings that all lead into a true ramp with a monkey dude next to it. The monkey dude lobs a coconut projectile at players. So, the ring system is introduced in the easiest way here, as players aren't required to jump as they were in previous Sonic games to obtain their first rings. But if players are running, that means they'll be introduced to rings at the same time they're introduced to a true ramp system. The monkey dude is similar to the coconut of Sonic 2 in that they hang out on trees and lob coconuts, but still slightly different. For one, coconuts of Sonic 2 have an infinite supply of coconuts. Meanwhile, the monkey dude seems to only have one coconut in stock, and then he's out. I could be wrong here, but I think the monkey dude also has a higher lob than the coconut, meaning that players have more time to react to the projectile. At least when I place footage of the two monkeys side by side, that's how it looks to me. The coconuts could definitely be a pain to avoid in Sonic 2, so it seems the Sonic team might have felt similarly, so they designed a slightly easier variation of the same enemy type for Sonic 3. While the coconuts threw their coconuts out from their bodies, the monkey dude has a long arm, which is where he throws his coconut from. This is likely another concession to make the enemy a little easier, because when the coconut is throwing its projectile, players would be jumping right into the projectile when attempting to destroy a coconut. Here, if players jump into a monkey dude to destroy it, because of the long arm, there's a good chance they'll avoid getting hit by the projectile. Back to our opening moments, players have a simple enemy where they can possibly lose rings and learn that system. One of the biggest departures in this opening moment, though, is that immediately, if players take the ramp with speed, they should see a hidden spring in one of the palm trees and a moving ramp that will take them back up to the top left of the screen above where they just come from. Whereas there were some exploratory elements in Sonic 1 that could lead to secrets like rings, extra lives, or monitors with things like a shield, and Sonic 2 ramped this up a little bit for the sake of checkpoints that could lead to finding Chaos Emeralds. For the most part, the stages were pretty straightforward progress from point A to point B type of stages. And the opening moments showcase that, as even when there were branching paths, it was just another way to go in the same direction, just at a different Y position on the screen and with slightly different obstacles. However, here, players are immediately shown that there's something where they can wrap back around behind them that leads to, in this case, rings and speed shoes. It immediately speaks to the fact that there's going to be exploration, and if players search behind them in different routes, they just might find something special. This is something that's going to be especially important in Sonic 3, with the way that both its traversal through stages and Chaos Emerald hunting are laid out, with less straightforward stage design and secrets hidden throughout. Another notable element is that the rock just after the spring ramp hidden in the palm tree can be destroyed by simply jumping on it, which leads to a hidden spring, giving another option for how players can traverse vertically to the hidden area on the top left. What's notable here though is the destructible rocks. While players might miss this, there is definitely a chance some will jump into the rock and destroy it, thus learning about destructible ground, which we'll see more of moving forwards. After this sequence, there's a route above players, but Sonic won't be able to reach this, making it a route only accessible to Tails in the case of Sonic 3. So, branching paths might be meant for different characters, but this is also notable because later on, depending on the route they take, players will probably notice a zipline that leads up and to the left and have no idea how to get there if they're playing as Sonic. So the route is hinted at further along, with this being a nice visual indicator, and should create a bit of mystery for first-time players as to how they can reach this seemingly inaccessible route. Taking the bottom path, players should notice that, once again, there's a path forwards to their right, or they can see what's behind them to the left. Even if players miss the first signal that there's things to explore on different levels and the game might not be as straightforward as Sonic's 1 or 2, this is now a very clear sign, with the game once again showing players, hey, you should try exploring. If players explore to the left and destroy the rocks, they'll discover their first special stage ring. Even if players don't catch this, there are a couple of springs right afterwards which will spring players right to where the rock cluster is, intentionally placed so players might accidentally discover this special stage ring. So, special stages are hidden in the level, and you'll need to explore to find them. But wait, let's say you missed this and you're a first-time player, and you know, I'm playing an action platform game, so I go from left to right. Or let's say you see the rocks, don't know you can destroy them, or don't know about spin dashing or rolling yet. The game has you covered. Fast forward to Angel Island Zone Act 2. After you defeat the mini-boss of Fire Breath, you are forced to destroy some of these rocks. So the game gives you a moment to try and discover the relatively simple controls of Sonic 3. This is also a nice way to force new players to learn that spin dashing and or rolling exists as a part of Sonic's moveset. After that, you will go through one of these roll tunnels that will shoot forwards and force you into breaking a rock wall right into one of the secret caves that holds a special stage ring. You'll fly up against the wall as the ring appears, meaning if you backtrack at all, you'll immediately touch the giant ring and be transported to a special stage. So, while the first special stage ring of Act 1 is incredibly easy to find, you're allowed to miss it, and the game doesn't necessarily guide you to it. However, later on in Act 2, the game forces you into learning about the special stage rings and how you can destroy walls to go into secret caves. There's an argument to be had that this should have happened in Act 1 because players would have learned this immediately. But I like that this is taught instead in Act 2, because by doing this in Act 2, if players missed a special stage, or this is their first one, they might start to wonder, wait a moment, were there hidden caves like this I missed in Act 1? And if they go back and replay Act 1, they'll quickly discover that is the case, and now really have that exploration factor of Sonic 3 reinforced on them. Past this special ring in Act 1, there are now 2 routes players can take to progress further through the stage, which is Sonic 3 now clearly showing players there are alternate routes. Further along the stage, players will find a hollowed out tree, which acts as Sonic 3's first wow moment. Sonic 1 had the loop, Sonic 2 had the corkscrew, and now Sonic 3 has Sonic running up in circles around the inside of a tree. To be honest, I don't think I quite clocked that was what Sonic was doing when I was a kid, but it is a cool little visual. Our next major wow moment comes from the introduction to the Fire Breath. The Fire Breath will shoot missiles into the air as players see far more passing by in the background, with the missiles setting the stunning tropical jungle of Angel Island into a fiery nightmare. It's a really cool in-game cinematic moment that's quick and visually shows players the destruction Robotnik is already causing. It also completely changes the visuals of Angel Island, once again creating a wow factor to Sonic 3. As an aside, I don't exactly understand why Robotnik is setting the jungle on fire. You'd think he'd want to harvest the wood of the trees and chop it down, not just burn everything to ashes. So it's visually cool, but I don't really see the purpose of this other than just pure evil. At this point, we've definitely made it through the opening moments of Sonic 3, but one more thing I want to touch on for Act 1, specifically, is the elemental shields. There are a couple elemental shields players can find throughout Angel Island Zone Act 1, but most of these are missable. So in a nice touch, just before the Fire Breath boss, players will find an immediately obvious fire shield. The fire shield just happens to keep players completely safe from getting hurt by the fire of the Fire Breath mini-boss, so setting it here serves the double purpose of showing players how the shields can work to protect players from its specific element. While nothing requires players to learn how to use the additional attack of the fire shield, you are being taught through playing that this is a different and more interesting shield than we've seen in prior Sonic games. Continuing the lessons about elemental shields, right after the mini-boss and at the start of Act 2, players will come to a bed of water. If they still have the fire shield, it will be extinguished, immediately teaching this lesson about elemental shields. One other element players might notice, and I certainly did when I was first playing Sonic 3, are these clearly destructible rocks that sit just before the mini-boss players can't destroy. While the other rocks like this were on the ground, these ones are further up on a wall, so that does visually indicate why Sonic can't destroy them, as he can't roll into them on the ground. As it turns out, this is a special route that only Knuckles can take in Sonic and Knuckles, and it's fun that this is teased here in Sonic 3. Okay, so these are the opening ideas and how they're presented at the start of Angel Island Zone Act 1, and how they're progressively shown throughout Angel Island Zone in general. Outside of teaching how elemental shields work and some of the very basic mechanics of Sonic, everything feels structured around teaching players exploration, and that's going to be a theme throughout Sonic 3. Because of the special rings being hidden within the walls of the stage, you're really encouraged to explore every nook and cranny, and I feel like Angel Island Zone definitely teaches players that concept. Zooming out, in general, I think Angel Island has a lot more verticality to its traversal than Sonic's 1 or 2. Rather than a distinct high route, middle route, and lower route players can take, which those games could sometimes fall into, Angel Island has players regularly dropping down, then climbing up. You might be in a higher section, only for a zipline to take you back down. You'll find yourself hitting dead ends to the right, then platforming up a section, wrapping back to the left, platforming up further, and then finally progressing further right, only to once again be brought diagonally back downhill to another sequence you'll have to climb up. So that seems to be the general cadence of the two stages. While there are certainly sections made for acceleration, running, and speed, you'll be traveling back and forth far more frequently here than in the opening stage of any of the prior Sonic games. Not only does that speak to what the general stage design of Sonic 3 is going to be about, but it also makes the game feel more exploratory by nature, even if you are going through the proper route. You're not just going left to right, there's much more going on in the actual routing of the stage, and if you go the wrong way by accident, that could be an interesting alternate route, or perhaps what leads to a helpful secret. From a moment-to-moment challenge standpoint, none of the concepts thrown at players are particularly deadly or challenging, as this is Stage 1. The enemies are basic, and most of the platform challenges come in gaps that players will need to cross, platforms that could collapse and drop the player down, with spikes being the primary obstacle that can injure players. While Angel Island Zone is only 2 acts, it is absolutely giant, with the team trying to make the stages far larger than they were in Sonic 2. This is also going to be a theme of Sonic 3, with all of the acts dwarfing the length of the acts from prior Sonic games. So Angel Island Zone is very different from the opening stages of Sonic's 1, 2, and CD, and I think your feelings on Angel Island Zone will probably be fairly indicative of how you end up feeling about Sonic 3 as a whole. For my part, I absolutely love Angel Island Zone, and it's probably my favorite opening zone of any of the classic Sonic games. Honestly, I think part of that has to do with the music and general jungle aesthetic, which both really click with me, but I also happen to really enjoy the exploratory nature of Angel Island Zone. Before moving on to the bosses of Angel Island Zone, there is a brand new mechanic players might have noticed if they cross a checkpoint with 20 or more rings. In Sonic 2, hitting a checkpoint with 50 or more rings takes players to a special stage where they can collect Chaos Emeralds. However, here, players only need 20, and instead, it takes players to a bonus stage. I always thought the stage this took players to was random, but in doing research, there's actually a rhyme and reason to this, so thank you to the true heroes who put in the effort discovering this. The number of rings players have when they cross a checkpoint determines which bonus stage they'll go to if they enter the stars that appear over the checkpoint. The color of the stars also indicates which bonus stage players will be traveling to. There are 3 bonus stages: the Slot Machine, the Glowing Spheres, and the Gumball Machine. The stage players enter rotates every 15 rings the player is holding, starting at 20 rings. If the stars are yellow, players will be taken to the Slot Machine. If the stars are red, players will be taken to the Glowing Spheres. Finally, if the stars are white, players will be taken to the Gumball Machine. I went ahead and put together a chart on Google Sheets to visually show these numbers, if you're only listening to this video, and want to take a glance. I also checked back on all of my footage to make sure these values aligned with what I was actually seeing in the game, and both my Sonic 3 on Genesis and Sonic Origins footage matched these values. So, with 20 to 34 rings, players will enter the Slot Machine. With 35 to 49 rings, players will enter the Glowing Spheres. With 50 to 64 rings, players will enter the Gumball Machine, and then repeat that pattern, but adding 15 to each of those numbers. I highly doubt players will notice the 15 ring rotation, so it's nice that there's a visual indicator for players if there are specific bonus stages they want to go to, or ones they want to avoid. For example, I've never particularly liked the Slot Machine, but I enjoy the Glowing Sphere minigame, and that's the one I always hoped I'd end up in. Before talking about each bonus stage on their own, as a whole, the system is one that really makes Sonic 3 a little easier than Sonic's 1 and 2. The Slot Machine gives players a chance to get more rings towards becoming Supersonic, and probably more important to most players, I guess, both the Glowing Spheres and Gumball Machine can allow players to collect both 1-ups and elemental shields. I know for my part, the only reason I really ever went into these stages was to try to get an elemental shield, or to get more rings for Supersonic. I'd also hop into these if I was starting to run low on rings while Supersonic was active, just as a way to get more rings and keep the Supersonic ability going. Because players need rings to even enter the bonus stages, it's not like this is making the game drastically easier, but again, it does serve as an additional way to get 1-ups and elemental shields, so it does act to lower the difficulty a little bit. These bonus stages can then definitely serve as a nice additional mini challenge for newer players or for players going for an incredibly high score, but they are time consuming and pull players away from the actual game. That does make the optional nature of them nice, although I do think half of the time I end up in these stages, it's by accident, and I'm trying to leave them as quickly as possible. So, in a way, these can also serve as hindrances for players who aren't looking to waste time outside of the main game. I do think, for most players, this is a positive addition that adds more gameplay variety and, again, serves as another tool to help them through a stage they might be struggling with, especially once players get into Sonic and Knuckles. But honestly, I think I could do without these. The gameplay of the bonus stages isn't as much fun as the normal Sonic gameplay, and even when I go into the stages on purpose, I probably would have had a better time if I just played through the game normally. But where do you fall on the bonus stages of Sonic 3? The first bonus stage players can go to is the Slot Machine. It's fitting that this is the bonus stage that requires the least amount of rings, only requiring 20 to 34 rings, due to the fact that players can't collect elemental shields here, or 1-ups unrelated to ring total. The stage is essentially a combination of the rotation mechanic from the special stages of Sonic 1 and the slot machine mechanic of Casino Night Zone from Sonic 2. Players will need to play with the physics of the rotating maze to bounce into the slot machine, and after a wall is hit, it slowly chips away into a goal, which will take players out of the bonus stage once hit. While sometimes I'll test my luck here to see if I can get a jackpot, I've never been the biggest fan of the bonus stage. It works fine and there's nothing objectively bad about it. I'm just not a big fan. The second bonus stage players can make it to is the Glowing Spheres. The Glowing Spheres is the most challenging of the 3 bonus stages, as players will be rotating around a sphere and shoot off in whichever direction Sonic's momentum and trajectory takes him to. Players can actively control his trajectory with the D-pad. The general goal is to travel up where there's rings and special glowing spheres that can turn into bubbles with goodies Sonic can collect if he then pops the bubble. To make things more interesting, there's also pinball bumpers and pinball flippers as players travel up, while a giant laser beam slowly tracks upwards. The game ends if players reach the top or are hit by the laser beam. This one actually requires timing and skill, and as such, I always find it to be a lot of fun. Because it uses momentum and trajectory, it still feels in line with Sonic's normal gameplay, and I think that's another part of what makes this bonus stage fun. While it is an aside from the normal stages, this is one that I'm always happy appears, and will always do my best to make it to the top while collecting as many rings as I can. Finally, the third bonus stage is the Gumball Machine. Here, the player is in a vertical shaft, with bumpers on both walls that will propel players upwards, similar to how these functioned in Metropolis Zone of Sonic 2. At the top of the stage is a Gumball Machine, and if players hit the crank, a gumball will drop out, which could be one of multiple goodies, such as an elemental shield, rings, or a 1-up. The catch is, the bumpers that Sonic bounces off of will disappear after he hits them, and these are also holding the Gumball Machine up. So if both bumpers directly below the Gumball Machine disappear, it will lower. On top of that, the bottom of the vertical shaft is a floor of vertical springs. After players hit this once, the floor crumbles, revealing a pit. And if players drop into that pit, they'll exit the minigame. It's a simple and fun concept that reuses an element from Sonic 2 in an interesting and low-stakes way. This is actually probably more interesting than how the bumpers were used in Sonic 2, because players would simply go up a shaft that included these, whereas here, players actually need to be thoughtful about their bumper usage if they want to get items. Something I like about this game is that it's fast, especially if I'm looking for an elemental shield. You can pop into this bonus stage, quickly try to get the elemental shield you're after, and then leave. So, all in all, my favorite bonus stages in order are the Glowing Spheres, the Gumball Machine, and then the Slot Machine. Make it through Act 1, and Sonic 3 introduces yet another new element to the series. Whereas in the past, players would fight a boss only at the end of the final act of whichever zone Sonic is in Sonic 3, there's now a sub-boss players will face at the end of Act 1. While that could make Sonic 3 feel like it's crammed with bosses, considering how much longer the stages are in Sonic 3, it's something I never noticed. The Fire Breath is a very basic introductory boss, as it should be. Its pattern is simple: fly down, wait, shoot out a flamethrower blast, wait, fly up, cross the screen, then repeat. Not only can the flamethrower hurt the player, but so too can the fire at the bottom of the Fire Breath that helps it hover and move. As I mentioned earlier, I think a big part of this boss fight is really meant to teach players about elemental shield protections, as the Fire Shield will completely trivialize everything about this boss. While it's fun to rapidly air dash into the sub-boss with the Fire Shield, players can also hop onto the Fire Breath and wait, as they'll rapidly bounce on it and destroy it before it has a chance to really move. This fight is a little different and more complex with Knuckles, but again, I'm sticking to Sonic 3 here. So nothing about this boss is really challenging at all, but as a tool to teach players how the elemental shields work and something to lightly introduce the concept of bosses and sub-bosses, I think this works. Plus, after seeing one of these Burn Angel Island zones jungle into a fiery mess, who wouldn't want to take this thing out? Destroy the Fire Breath, and yet another new concept is introduced, with a new functionality to the Sonic signposts. In Sonics 1, 2, and CD, these signposts appeared at the end of acts without a boss. It was a fun way to indicate the end of a stage, and played into the speed element of Sonic, as the signpost would rapidly spin after Sonic ran into it, changing from an image of Robotnik into an image of Sonic. Now that there's a sub-boss at the end of every Act 1, and a Dr. Robotnik fight at the end of every Act 2, that doesn't leave room for a signpost. So instead, after destroying the sub-boss of Act 1, the signpost will drop from the sky, and once it hits the ground, that signals the end of the stage. But the team decided to have more fun with this. If Sonic jumps and hits the signpost before it hits the ground, his momentum will bounce up and knock the signpost in whichever direction he hit it. On top of that, there are hidden monitors in the ground, and if the signpost lands in the correct spot, it will bounce up, revealing that monitor. Players can then collect that monitor before the act ends, or even wait until the next act starts and collect the monitor then. So it's a fun little secret, and the team even thought about how to showcase this mechanic to new players. For defeating the Fire Breath, the signpost will drop right over where players defeated the sub-boss, and the very first location the sub-boss is, on the far right of the screen, just so happens to be right over a hidden monitor. So long as players defeat the Fire Breath on this side and don't jump into the signpost will automatically reveal this new feature. While I'm sure many players won't destroy the Fire Breath here their first time playing, there is a good chance on one playthrough, they or one of their siblings or friends will discover this and share the news. So it's a really clever way to teach players this optional new mechanic. The mechanic itself is also fun, as it creates an optional little minigame after defeating a sub-boss. Players can see how long they can keep up the signpost, or try to find hidden treasure, one playthrough at a time. Before heading to our first boss of the Flame Mobile, there is another mechanic shift I mentioned and we should go over, and that's in the special stages, both in how they actually work and in terms of how players actually access them this time around. In Sonic 1, players found a special stage at the end of an act by jumping into a giant ring that would appear if they had 50 or more rings. Sonic CD worked in the same manner. In Sonic 2, players found special stages at checkpoints. If players had 50 or more rings and hit a checkpoint, stars would appear above the checkpoint players could jump into and access the special stage. In this way, checkpoints played double duty, and sometimes checkpoints were placed in obscure out-of-reach areas that felt more like secrets because the intent was really that they were placed as special stage access points. That made finding special stages in Sonic 2 start to become more exploration-based. Yes, you'd naturally find these checkpoints playing the stage normally, but you could find more and therefore have more attempts at finding Chaos Emeralds if you explored around each stage. So, Sonic 3 takes the concept of exploratory special stages and doubles down on it. Now, special stages are found by accessing giant rings in hidden rooms. These rooms aren't completely hidden in that there's always some sort of hint of a hallway that will lead to the giant ring room. Whether it be a destructible wall or some hallway hinted at by the artwork, where yes, there's a wall, but you can see through certain portions and understand that there happens to be a hallway. This new idea allows for a number of things. For one, the team is now free to have as many or as few giant rings in each stage as they feel is fitting, without worrying about too many additional consequences. Because Sonic 2 had players accessing special stages through the checkpoints, that meant that every checkpoint the team placed for the purpose of accessing a special stage could also tip the difficulty of the stage in a way the team didn't want. It could create too many checkpoints, making the stage easier than intended. Or if the checkpoint is in some far off, hard to reach location and players die, well, now they're returning to a far off, hard to reach location and are punished for activating that checkpoint. If we look at totals in terms of accessing the special stages, Sonic 1 had 10 chances to obtain all of its 6 Chaos Emeralds throughout the course of its 6 main zones, as you couldn't access special stages in Scrap Brain Zone. Sonic 2 had 62 chances to obtain all of its 7 Chaos Emeralds over the course of its 9 zones that contained checkpoints. Sonic CD had 14 chances to obtain all of its 7 Time Stones over the course of its 7 zones. And now, Sonic 3 has a total of 43 giant rings to access special stages to obtain all of its 7 Chaos Emeralds over the course of its 6 zones. So that is less opportunities than Sonic 2 allowed, although now that there is no 50 ring requirement, I think it's actually easier to find and get into the special stages of Sonic 3. These giant rings being hidden are probably the largest reason the gameplay of Sonic 3 shifts to being much more exploration-based. While the level design of the stages encourage exploration, the big reward for exploring is in finding a giant ring. If players haven't obtained Supersonic, this is how to get him, and if players have obtained Supersonic, this will give players a free 50 rings, meaning they can immediately use the Supersonic ability if they choose. I do think that this was a nice and necessary touch if the team wanted players to be exploring the stages, rather than simply blazing through them. While 1-ups, rings, and shields were rewarding to find if players went off the beaten path in prior games, this is far more incentivizing. So this further creates a shift in level design and structure, as now players will want to look at every wall for a hidden room. And it's a shift that I'm sure splits the Sonic fanbase, and part of the reason why people might prefer Sonic 2 or Sonic 3 of the classic games. That's not to discount Sonic CD or Sonic 1, it's more that typically I've seen people debating Sonic 2 or Sonic 3 and Knuckles as being the best classic Sonic game. If you want a more straightforward action platform game, these hidden giant rings are going to detract from that type of experience. But if you enjoy a mix of action platforming with some light exploration, this perfectly fits that mold. I tend to go back and forth depending on my mood and what game I want to play, but this has been my favorite version of accessing the special stages in any of the Sonic games that I've played. Generally, I love looking for secrets and combing through stages, so this definitely fits my personal preferences. So you've found a giant ring, and for leaping into it, you will end up in Sonic 3's brand new take on special stages. Once again, like all of the special stages we've seen so far, it's another graphical showcase and something that seems partially intended to wow players and push the console to its limits. Sonic 1 had unique rotation with a momentum system that was incredibly impressive from a programming standpoint. Sonic 2 created the appearance of a faux 3D ramp that Sonic was running through, which required all kinds of tricks to pull off. Sonic CD used sprite rotation and scaling in a manner similar to Mode 7 for its special stages, which was unique to the Sega CD over the Sega Genesis. And now, Sonic 3 has this 3-dimensional globe that Sonic is running across with a faux 3D model. This isn't 3D. All of this had to be mathed out in order to create the illusion of 3D. That is truly impressive. But what's even more impressive is, to my opinion, this is the best special stage we've gotten yet, and probably my personal favorite special stage in any Sonic game. The way it works is players will always be running forwards and over time, slowly ramping up in speed until hitting a certain max speed, creating much more frenzied play. The only thing players can do is turn on the grid or jump. In Sonic 3, there are blue spheres, red spheres, bumpers, and coins. Yellow spring spheres would come later in Sonic and Knuckles. The goal of the game is to collect every blue sphere without touching a red sphere, which will instantly trigger a fail state if players touch one. A bumper will reverse the player's direction, although they can tap forwards to correct this. Touching a blue sphere turns it into a red sphere. But if the blue spheres create a grid larger than 4, players can choose to only collect the spheres on the perimeter, which will automatically destroy and collect every sphere inside upon completion, and the entire grid of spheres will turn into collectible rings. So it's a simple game, but one that creates a surprising amount of fun thanks to the ramped up tension of running faster and faster, and the surprisingly large number of interesting layouts the team was able to come up with. And ultimately, that's what a lot of good games are. They have simple rules, with the complexity around those simple rules creating different types of challenges. In fact, if players attach Sonic and Knuckles to Sonic 1, they can play randomly generated special stages that use pre-made portions in a random order. According to Sonic Retro, there are so many different combinations from this that the cart combo includes over 100,000 levels. Unlike the randomized blue sphere stages of the Sonic 1 Sonic and Knuckles combo, I'm sure that the stages of Sonic 3 were handcrafted. Now, I will say, while I happen to enjoy these special stages, they can be incredibly stressful. It's pretty rare that I'll lose to one of these nowadays, but given the limited nature of only being able to play one of these if you find a new giant ring, like the other special stages, it can be very frustrating to make a mistake and lose. I don't personally think Sonic 3's special stages get too difficult, but Sonic and Knuckles is another story. And I do imagine if you're not particularly good at these special stages, the fact that it is required for acquiring Super Sonic could potentially be a huge sore spot. That's obviously true of any special stage in the Sonic games, but I do think Sonic 3's special stages potentially require a larger degree of quick twitch reactions compared to the other special stages we've seen. Speaking of Super Sonic, for beating all 7 special stages and acquiring all 7 Chaos Emeralds, players will be able to once again transform into Super Sonic. As far as I'm aware, Super Sonic controls and acts exactly as he does in Sonic 2, although he does have an updated visual. The main change in Sonic 3 comes in how to actually activate Super Sonic. In Sonic 2, if players so much as jumped once they had 50 or more rings, they would automatically transform into Super Sonic even if they didn't want to, and there are situations where having Super Sonic isn't ideal. So, in Sonic 3, this was corrected. Activating Super Sonic functions exactly like all of Sonic's other mid-air abilities, where players will need to hit the action button while in mid-air, just like using the Insta-Shield, although players will once again need 50 or more rings. So if players don't want to become Super Sonic, it's a matter of not activating your Insta-Shield after obtaining 50 rings. Additionally, if players have a shield, this will also prevent the Super Sonic transformation, as pressing the action button in the air, even with 50 or more rings, will continue to use the shield's ability. It gives far more control to players and is a major step up for that. One more thing to note, while Sonic can become Super Sonic, even though Tails can collect Chaos Emeralds, he cannot transform in the original Sonic 3. Although, updated versions of Sonic 3 and Knuckles would change this, allowing players to transform into Super Tails. So if you're playing Sonic Origins, for example, you can activate Super Tails. Make it to the end of Angel Island Zone Act 2, and players will reach Dr. Robotnik in the Flame Mobile. Before even starting, I have to say, his introduction is fantastic. We first see him gliding past in the background behind a series of trees Sonic is running through after a ship attempts to bomb Sonic. Sonic then reaches a waterfall, when suddenly, Robotnik appears from behind the waterfall as if to say, "Surprise! It was me all along." From there, Robotnik will shoot his flames below him, destroying a bridge Sonic had crossed, move behind the waterfall, and the true boss fight begins. This attack not only creates the true boss arena, with deadly pits on the sides, but also safely shows the player what one of Robotnik's attacks will be. Robotnik will then move in and out of water, attacking when he's out. If he's above Sonic, he'll shoot 2 flames downwards, just like we saw during his introduction. If he's lower, Robotnik will shoot 2 flames diagonally down that will then track along the ground. And that's pretty much it. The true danger of the fight lies in rushing to attack Robotnik at the start and potentially not bouncing off of him properly, so you cause yourself to fall into an insta-death pit. Or trying to attack him right as he moves back into the waterfall, again causing Sonic to fly off to his instant death. Otherwise, so long as you have rings, even though you shouldn't jump directly into him when he's above, you can and can simply iframe through him. Still, this does make the Flame Mobile the most complex and challenging introductory Robotnik fight since Sonic 1. There's far higher stakes thanks to the instant death pits, and he has a genuine attack pattern, as simple as it is. Sonic 2 and Sonic CD went the route of having incredibly easy opening Robotnik boss fights, especially Sonic 2, where he simply moves back and forth. As that was the first boss fight of Sonic's 2 and CD, that does make sense the team would want an extra easy introduction. But here, I think thanks to the Fire Breath sub-boss, the team probably felt a little more at ease to create a slightly more challenging boss fight in the Flame Mobile. And that does create a much more interesting boss fight, to my opinion, even though it is so simple. While Sonic CD attempted to drastically change how boss fights felt, trying to make them feel more like extensions of stages at times, Sonic 3 continues the Sonic 2 trend of traditional boss fights, and I think overall does a good job of interesting fights that toe the line between simple, as Sonic's not really a game about combat, but challenging enough to be interesting. For defeating the Flame Mobile and saving a number of captured creatures, as is standard Sonic fare by now, Sonic will begin running to a bridge, only to once again encounter Knuckles. Knuckles menacingly laughs before flipping a switch that destroys the bridge Sonic and Tails are standing on, transitioning nicely into Hydrocity Zone. Hey, wasn't that just an insta-death pit before? Good old plot armor. These fun stage transitions are another new feature to Sonic 3 and helps connect the otherwise disjointed levels. Some of these work better than others, while a good portion could, honestly, generically work for any stage. This transition dropping down a waterfall and falling into Hydrocity Zone is perfect, and really, I don't think any other stage could have connected this way. That means this was probably one of the final elements that was created for the game, because stage order would have needed to be set. After that though, the transitions are much more generic. The Hydrocity transition of shooting out from the water could have connected to anything. Think about it, you shoot out of a cannon at the end of Carnival Night Zone, and at the end of the day, it's the same thing. You're going to be falling into the next stage. Even the end of Marble Garden Zone is the same thing, because Tails is dropping you down into the next stage. The end of Ice Cap Zone sees Sonic burrowing through a bunch of snow, with him then popping out of a snowy mountain at the start of Launch Base Zone. Again, this could have technically happened at just about any other location in Sonic 3, they would have just needed to add some snow at the start of the level. This isn't a complaint, by the way, it's just an observation. Generally speaking, I think this is a really fun new element to Sonic 3, and even if some of these transitions from stage to stage are a little generic in that they could be connected in any way, I still think they're a lot of fun. It also means the team gave themselves a little wiggle room if they did want to reorder some of these stages. I suppose the one downside is that for players trying to speed through the game, who have played it time and time again, you're going to be watching the same mini cutscene over and over again. But for such a short transitional cutscene, I really don't think that's a big deal. This is one of those little quality stamps that isn't necessary and did take some extra time to create, but it's exactly that. Something that adds a little more polish to the game, and thanks to that, it makes the world feel a little more alive. After a quick transitional cutscene, players are dropped into Hydrocity Zone. Hydrocity Zone. Alright, I've been jokingly bouncing back and forth on how I pronounce this, but it is a real debate among Sonic fans. Typically, if something is two words in Sonic titles, there's a space between it, like Green Space Hill Zone. So, if it's Hydrocity, wouldn't there be a space in the middle? So Hydrocity might be a fun play on if you combine Hydro with City. It could spell out similar to Velocity, and then that's a fun play into Sonic's speed and momentum. Velocity, Hydrocity. But it's an underwater city, so Hydrocity. Looking at the Japanese katakana, it's Hydrocity Zone, which would probably speak to Hydrospace City being the correct actual pronunciation. Or hey, maybe whoever was creating the title card realized the play on words of Hydrocity, and now it's canon. I don't know. I'm going to probably bounce back and forth my pronunciation again moving forwards, as I can see both arguments. Coming back around to the level design, I very much think of Hydrocity as both Sonic 3's chemical plant zone and the game's main water level. As the level starts though, there are a couple spiky enemies who can easily catch players off guard since players won't have any rings yet, and I think a nice minor raising of the stakes. Players will start the stage underwater, and if you played a Sonic game before, that means you know you need to start moving or you're going to drown. And if you rush to the left, an Insta-Shield can easily take care of these enemies, but otherwise, you might just learn the hard way that the baby rails are now off. So I think this is a cool introduction to the stage, as it doesn't give players a moment to rest given you're underwater, and means you have to get going immediately. Another fun element to the start is that there's actually an optional alternate path for Tails, and eventually Knuckles, at the top right. So another pointer that the team was cognizant of Tails being able to fly, and Knuckles being able to climb, and creating unique areas that are only accessible to those characters, therefore altering the overall level design and upping the stage complexity. There are a lot of new fun little gimmicks throughout Hydrocity, including rushing water, where Sonic will be forced forwards from the water pressure and desperately cling onto poles that then break when the player chooses, and these gear hands that launch players forwards, somewhat similar to the launchers from Chemical Plant Zone of Sonic 2. However, while those immediately launch players forwards, this one has a brief wind-up to it, which acts to give players a moment to take in what's about to happen and properly react to it. So it does then function differently, and becomes both a little more fair and less challenging in that way at the same time. It's not that the speed boosts from Chemical Plant Zone were unfair, per se, especially since you can spot them, but they could catch players off guard and shoot you forwards without having proper time to react, while this gives players ample time. I think they both serve different purposes, and I think of the one in Chemical Plant Zone as being a slightly more advanced mechanic. The underwater portions of Hydrocity are fairly short, and relatively simple compared to the prior Sonic games. Sonic 1's Labyrinth Zone definitely had the most underwater sequences and direct challenges, but Sonic 2 still tried to play off of that, even if it was fairly mild. Sonic 2's Aquatic Ruin Zone has similar challenges, but only as a hazard players will drop into, with the entire stage being about trying to stay out of the water, as the water is the dangerous area. So now we come to Hydrocity, and the underwater sequences are now sometimes required, but also incredibly brief and much less challenging than Sonic's 1 and 2. It's pretty simple to blaze through most of these sequences without a thought about the drowning mechanic, and even then, players can collect the water shield, which will prevent them from drowning anyways. While there are some minor challenges underwater involving piranhas, spikes, and gears, for the most part, the acts either have sequences that quickly launch players through these sections, like the rushing water I talked about, or they're used as set dressing, where players will be on something that's already launched them forwards and they're propelled through and out of the water anyways. That does make sense to me. While I don't hate the water mechanics of Sonic, it does take away a lot of what's fun about the Sonic games, which is Sonic's momentum and that overall game feel. So that's where Sonic 2 smartly used water as a hazard instead of required traversal, and now Sonic 3 says, okay, yes, you have to go through water sometimes, but it'll be quick and it's not a major hazard. As I said at the start, Hydrocity also reminds me of Chemical Plant Zone, as there are huge ramps in the stage that players will be flying down, with major sections that have players crossing back and forth across the screen for progression. That means there's a lot of clever pathing here, where players will be progressing and sometimes seeing the route that's technically further ahead, but maybe not even realizing that. For example, there's this section near the end of Act 2 with a hidden ring. I figured while I was playing as Tails, I'd explore to see what was above me since I could fly. Flying up took me through a bridge, and then right back to earlier in the stage, and I had to replay a short portion to get back to where I was. So this little bridge I was going over I hadn't thought much about before, turned out it was directly connected to a later portion of the stage. The team didn't have to have this bridge here, and it could have been normal flooring, But that Tails access and realization of how the stage was connected is a nice touch. As Hydrocity has so many speed boosters, that means a lot of the cool portions of the stage players won't actually be doing much, and will really just be watching Sonic play the game as they sit back and watch. But since they're briefly woven throughout normal gameplay, I don't think that's a big deal, and I always thought these sequences were fun as you get to see Sonic absolutely fly. You actually can control and stop Sonic during these sequences if you want, although it's almost never a good idea. And hey, while I was playing around and testing this, I found out there were some insta-death pits in Hydrocity I never knew existed, so that was fun. While it's hard to top Chemical Plant Zone, and Hydrocity definitely feels like the Sonic team's attempt at Chemical Plant Zone Part 2, I think they did a fantastic job. It's a more exploratory Chemical Plant Zone, with hidden walls throughout, and a little more freedom in routes players can actively choose to progress through, which feels more fitting with the overall design of Sonic 3. It's such a fun stage that even if you hate water levels, you'll probably end up not minding and having a good time here anyways. Before moving on to the bosses of Hydrocity, I think this is a good time to stop and briefly talk about the incredibly subjective topics of art and music. Let's start with the art, and the reason I want to stop here is to admire the way the parallax scrolling is handled in Sonic 3, and in particular, the water of Hydrocity Zone. Let's rewind back to Sonics 1 and 2. When players fell through the water, there was a distinct water line that indicated where the water was, and the background and tiles would shift color hues accordingly to help indicate this change to players. That works just fine, and I had zero issues with it. But Sonic 3 took a look at that and said, we can do that better. The entire water line has its own unique set of parallax scrolling water, with the base of it being the water line. So, as players head up, you can see the water parallax scrolling in the background, creating the proper depth perception for the water, as you can see more and more of the water as you head up and are looking down. Because there are so many different water layers, that also means that there's a nice horizontal parallax effect on these, with a nice sense of movement, just like the backgrounds. But then, when players hit the water line, the parallax water evens out, and when they cross underneath the water line, all of those layers properly change colors into the underwater color palette, and properly vertically parallax scroll above players, now creating that same sense of depth, but as if you were looking up at the water. Another fun note about this is, this only happens in certain portions of Hydrocity. The start of the stage actually doesn't use this effect, and then if you go underwater in, say, Carnival Night Zone, again, this parallax scrolling isn't present. But come back to Launch Base Zone Act 2, and the effect is present again. So it creates a unique atmosphere when it's used, but one that's exceptionally and cleverly done. Going back to my Sonic CD video, something I complained about was that oftentimes, because of how much vertical parallax scrolling is in the game, with levels that are super tall, there would be several moments where both the depth perception and perspective of the backgrounds are off and doesn't work properly depending on where you are. But by using this waterline, it was this incredibly clever solution to that exact problem. And that idea of a line of something that's in front, with all of the parallax reacting behind it, is something we actually saw in Sonic 2 in Mystic Cave Zone, but we also see repeated in Sonic 3 to really help properly sell the depth and parallax scrolling. Take a look at Angel Island Zone. There are multiple tree lines with varying depths, indicated not only by their positioning on screen, but also their coloring. Very notably though, there's a tree line in the middle that's in front of everything else. So everything below it has slower parallax scrolling and appears behind that front tree line, and then everything above it also has slower parallax scrolling and appears behind that front tree line. Again, this feels like a great solve to that perspective issue that I think Sonic CD has. Here's another really smart thing about the backgrounds. As far as I can tell, with these parallax layers, the game is set up in horizontal bars with no transparency. This was the case in Sonics 1, 2, and CD, so likely a hardware limitation. But if you look at Angel Island Zone's forest, you won't notice those horizontal bars, because the team properly used colors and shading to mostly hide these. If you look at a set of trees, you'll see plenty of interesting leaves and lines that makes them look like proper trees with transparency behind them, and not just horizontal bars. But really, I think these are horizontal bars but they simply set the color of what should be transparent to the same color as the layer behind those trees. So you get the same effect as if there was transparency, even though there technically isn't. I also want to link a video by Displaced Gamers called Dithering on the Sega Genesis with Composite Video, which talks even further about specific visual tricks developers creatively used, and some that are lost in HD. These effects are true of any Sonic game, by the way, and not specific to Sonic 3. I just happened to find this video while researching this topic and wanted to share it. So how does the art of Sonic 3 compare to that of 1, 2, and CD? Well, gone are the geometric patterns that made Green Hill Zone of Sonic 1 so iconic. This was still somewhat present in Sonic 2, and you'll find a geometric pattern here and there in Sonic 3, but really, this is now a relic of Sonic 1, or Sonic CD, which as I talked about in that video, went all in. Sonic 2's background and tile work was far more intricate than that of Sonic 1, and Sonic 3 feels like it's yet another step up. There are also plenty of little details sprinkled throughout, such as small streams running down rocks in Angel Island Zone, or the Death Egg being rebuilt in the background of Launch Base Zone. For a direct comparison to Sonic 2 though, take a look at Casino Night Zone's background compared to that of Sonic 3's Carnival Night Zone. In Casino Night Zone, the sparkling city and lights are far off in the background, without too much movement as they're so far away. In Carnival Night Zone, all of those buildings are far closer, scrolling past Sonic, making it feel more like he's inside the city. Not only that, but these stages are constantly changing, whether it be Angel Island Zone being set on fire, players traversing seemingly deeper into the city of Hydrocity, or Ice Cap Zone's first act primarily taking place within an icy cave before being taken outside to see water and glaciers in the background. Now, that is all very cool, but do you like the art? And that is purely subjective, right? I know some people adore Sonic CD's dreamy art style, and I love the colors used, but because of the depth perception and perspective issues and geometric shape pattern thing that I think is a little obnoxious looking when it's overused, the art style didn't click with me, and I end up preferring Sonic 2 and 3's art style. But there is an element to that type of art that's really pretty, and I do think by being so much more realistic in its style, maybe the art loses a little bit of a dreamy creativity in the process. But still, I've been gushing about the art and choices in Sonic 3, and that's because I think it's really well done. One more element to talk about though are the sprites, because all of the sprites in Sonic 3 were completely redone. Sonic 2 saw Sonic have essentially the same sprite as in Sonic 1, just with an updated color. Sonic CD used the exact same sprite as Sonic 1, but added brand new animations. Sonic 3 completely changes Sonic's sprite. Putting animations aside, let's purely compare the base idle sprite of both Sonic 2 and Sonic 3. To me, Sonic 2's sprite feels more sleek, while Sonic 3's has more detail. In Sonic 3, Sonic is given larger hands, larger feet, and a mouth. Because the shoes and hands are bigger, they have more details, and you can see there's more shading in general on Sonic 3's sprite. I don't think one is objectively better than the other, but I do think I prefer Sonic 2's sprite work and like the clean simplicity of it. My friend who's the co-creator and artist on the game I'm making prefers the Sonic 3 sprite, so I really do think this is going to come down to personal tastes. Moving on to our next incredibly subjective topic, let's talk about the music of Sonic 3. Sonic 3's music is notorious for the age-old question of, did Michael Jackson work on the music, and if so, how much of the music did he work on, which tracks, and how much of each track? Or, if his music was removed, was there any remaining influence? From a behind-the-scenes interview in Games TM, Roger Hector, who's credited as an executive coordinator on Sonic 3, talks directly about this. Michael Jackson was a very big fan of Sonic, and he wanted to record a soundtrack for the game. He came to STI and met with the team to discuss the design theme, story, and feel of the game. He then went away and recorded an entire soundtrack that covered all of the worlds. It was fantastic. The music fitted perfectly for the games, and they had a distinctive Michael Jackson sound. We had it all ready and integrated into the game when the first news stories came out accusing him of things I won't mention due to YouTube monetization. And Sega had to back away from this collaboration. It was very late in the development process, and we had to quickly put together a complete replacement music track. Howard Drawson, STI's music guy, stepped in and did a great job, working around the clock to get it done. Despite the unexpected complications so late in the game, we were very happy with the final results. It was too bad nobody outside ever heard the Michael Jackson music. Is that true, though? When Sonic Origins released, it replaced a whole bunch of tracks including Ice Cap Zone, Carnival Night Zone, and Launch Base Zone, and Yuji Naka tweeted, "Does Sonic Origins Sonic 3 have a different song? Oh my god, the music for Sonic 3 has changed, even though Sega official uses Michael Jackson's music." He did later tweet out, "I feel like I'm being misunderstood a lot, probably because I don't speak English and I'm using a translation tool. Sorry." But, that sounds like confirmation to me that Michael Jackson did work on some of the final tracks used in Sonic 3, and those are the ones notably absent from Sonic Origins. Now, the composers actually credited to Sonic 3 within the game are Brad Buxer, Bobby Brooks, Daryl Ross, Jeff Grace, Doug Grisby III, and Skirako, with Bo, Sachio Ogawa, Milo, Masaru Setsumaru, Tetsuyuki Maeda, Tomonori Sawada, Masayuki Nagao, and Jen Sonoe getting credits for Sega's sound team. The sound project coordinator was Hisaki Nimiya. Point is, there are a lot of people who worked on the music and sounds to Sonic 3. Speaking of Jen Sonoe, who was credited on the original team, for those replaced tracks in Sonic Origins, according to Sonic's social media manager Katie Krasnowski, I'm totally butchering that and I'm sorry.
While unfortunately we can't use all of the original sounds from the Sega Genesis version of the game, Jun Sonoe has been working really hard to adapt the original music that was composed in 1993 for Sonic Origins. And he's been going so far as reproducing it with the same sound chip from the Sega Genesis and using his own digital audio tape collection to make this as faithful to the originals as possible.
To my understanding, it was the prototype music that he reworked and made for Sonic Origins. Back to those original tracks, here's the other obvious clue anyways, that Michael Jackson had probably been involved, before we got the Yuji Naka confirmation, I mean. The first person credited to work on the music was Brad Buxer, and Brad Buxer regularly worked with Michael Jackson in the 90s. And it sounds like the true person who wrote the now missing music was actually Brad Buxer. In an interview, he says,
"Like with Stranger in Moscow, I go knock on his door and I had under my arm a cassette player. I had been doing all the Sega Sonic the Hedgehog cues. Because the way Michael works is he'll tell Sega he'll do it and then he says, Brad, you do it, right? So I think we did one cue together with Michael, one, and the rest I had to do it myself. So I had the cassette thing under I had 41 cues done, and I said, I'm sure you want to hear the Sonic the Hedgehog. He said, no, just play something. And I started playing, and I played the verse for Stranger in Moscow, and then I came up with the chorus on the spot, and he loved it. He fell in love with it. And so in an hour and a half, Stranger in Moscow was written.
That was a cue that I already put into Sonic. It's on the ending credits of Sonic the Hedgehog 3. And it's in the same key and it has the same chords. And it's, I'm playing it like you would in a video game. So it sounded like this.
One of my absolute favorite songs from Sonic 3 is Ice Cap Zone's theme, and unfortunately, this was one removed from Sonic Origins, making Sonic Origins completely unplayable. No, but it was disappointing to me. The thing about Ice Cap Zone is that it doesn't sound at all like a Michael Jackson track, and as it turns out, this song comes from another Brad Buxer project. Brad Buxer had been in a band called the Jetsons, or Jetzones, I don't know the pronunciation, and they had an unreleased song called Hard Times that would be rewritten for Sonic 3. Sound familiar? All of the Jackson stuff aside, Sonic 3's soundtrack is interesting. Angel Island Zone is one of my favorite tracks in all of Sonic the Hedgehog, if not my favorite Sonic track, period. And I also think Hydrocity Zone has amazing music. In fact, the only music I'm torn on is the Michael Jackson stuff. Like, what is this track that plays for the sub-bosses? It's ridiculous. I'm sorry if you like it. It's just so weird and doesn't fit the game's aesthetic to me at all. But then Ice Cap Zone's theme is iconic. I happen to like Launch Bay Zone quite a bit, and then I could take it or leave it with Carnival Night Zone. I honestly doubt you were ever going to get a song I personally liked out of a creepy circus carnival, but who knows. While I happen to be okay with the new songs that replace Launch Base Zone and Sonic Origins on their own, it still just doesn't have the right feel to me, but maybe that's because I grew up on Sonic 3's original Launch Base Zone. I do have to wonder what the music would have sounded like in a world where the full team who worked on Angel Island Zone, Hydrocity, and the Sonic & Knuckles soundtrack had created every track for Sonic 3, because Sonic & Knuckles soundtrack slaps. It's also worth noting, this is the first Sega Genesis game not composed by Masato Nakamura, and I do have to wonder why that was. Was it because Michael Jackson wanted to work on the music, and there was no way Sega was going to turn down that offer? Or had Masato Nakamura gotten too expensive, as Sega didn't initially want to pay his higher fees for Sonic 2? Amazingly, I think for the most part, Sonic 3's music still fits within the sound font of what Masato Nakamura came up with, especially the non-Jackson related tracks. So overall, while I think there are some super weird songs from the Jackson team, there are also some really good ones, and the soundtrack in general is one I really enjoy. Make it through Hydrocity Zone Act 1, and players will reach Big Shaker. Big Shaker will track across the wall and ground from left to right, and then right to left, all while its missiles encircle it, preventing players from damaging the actual sub-boss. Afterwards, the Big Shaker will leap to the center of the screen, opening it up to attacks, then spin a device in the center, activating a whirlpool. This will spin Sonic and Tails, preventing either the sub-boss or the player from injuring each other. The one danger here is if players have been underwater for too long, it could lead to drowning from being stuck in the water. Afterwards, the Big Shaker will repeat its pattern, although players can get more attacks in before it does. Like the Fire Breath, the Big Shaker is another incredibly simple boss fight. Really, all that's asked of players is to jump over the attack at the correct timing twice, and then they can simply wail on the boss. But while it's incredibly simple, it is slightly more challenging than the Fire Breath, so to that end, it is a proper step up as it does require actual dodging this time around. The actual Whirlpool idea is an interesting one, but I don't think it plays out in a very interesting way. There's rarely any actual danger from the attack, and while it's visually interesting, it really comes down to simply waiting for it to be done before anything happens. I think if there had been a larger likelihood players had been stuck underwater before this attack, it would have been a fantastic and interesting attack, as something that keeps players underwater against their will, but as it stands, I'm not the biggest fan of its actual effect. That said, it is very easy to destroy the Big Shaker before it even has a chance to activate the Whirlpool attack, so I do appreciate that. Make it through Hydrocity Zone Act 2, and players will reach the Screw Mobile. The Screw Mobile is one of the more interesting Robotnik fights we've seen so far. Robotnik's machine has a propeller on the bottom, and jumping into the propeller will damage Sonic. So Robotnik will drop down and spin the propeller into the water, creating a small whirlpool. He'll then raise up, with the stream of water sucking into the propeller from the water. If players don't move, they'll get sucked into the vortex and risen up directly into Robotnik's propeller. Although it's easy enough to jump and avoid the power of the whirlpool, and this is also an opportunity to get attacks in. Once the whirlpool and vortex subside, the vortex of water will slowly drop down to the base water line, and players can actually use it as a platform to jump up and attack Robotnik again, meaning this attack has now created a nice opening for Sonic. Afterwards, the Screw Mobile will go into its second attack pattern, which is hovering back and forth and dropping bombs into the water. If the bomb explodes and hits Sonic, it will injure him. But the explosion also creates a water plume, and players can use this water plume to launch themselves up and get more attacks in on Robotnik. After that, the pattern repeats. I like how creative these attacks are in utilizing the water. Unlike the Whirlpool attack of the Big Shaker, the Screw Mobile's Whirlpool attack presents an actual danger, making it far more interesting. I especially like the bombs that create opportunities for players to launch out of the water. It's a fun mechanic to play with, and even though it is an opportunity to get attacks in, it also has a proper danger for players who are attempting this. The Screw Mobile is also a boss that's very different per skill level. For beginners, it's probably safest to only attack the Screw Mobile when it's dropping to do his Whirlpool attack, and then maybe use the Water Vortex as a platform for another attack. For slightly more advanced players, there's more opportunities with the Bomb attack. And then from there, players with the Water Shield can actually bounce on top of the Screw Mobile and quickly destroy it before it even has an opportunity for a single attack to finish. All of this makes for a fantastic boss fight, which should be simple enough for newer players, but with true opportunity to shorten the fight as players become more advanced. After defeating Robotnik and his Screw Mobile, players will be launched out of Hydrocity and straight into Marble Garden Zone. The start of the stage sees players immediately dropping down a giant hill with opportunities to jump off to different branches. It immediately introduces a very different kind of stage than we've seen before in Sonic, because Marble Garden Zone is much more about vertical traversal than horizontal traversal, and is a bit of a maze. It's not that we haven't seen vertical traversal before, of course, but that feels like a much larger theme here, with many of the obstacles based around this. There's a large number of floating and moving platforms players will need to traverse across, rotating platforms players will need to ride up, devices that look like records players will need to spin to rise up platforms, these latches players will grab that are then pulled up by the same record-like mechanism, and even the tops that shoot players forward across the ground can be used to fly through the air and reach otherwise unavailable platforms. The level is very interconnected, with plenty of routes everywhere, with the stage even looping vertically, meaning there's no true bottom or top to the stage, only adding to that maze-like feeling. So the team added signposts everywhere to help players understand the actual direction to the end of the stage, as they clearly realized just how confusing the layout could be. Act 2 also sees the introduction of crumbling and sinking ground, as part of the theme of this stage is Robotnik tunneling through the level for whatever devious purpose he has in mind, and destroying the stage in the process, as he couldn't care less what damage he does to the environment. This portion near the end, I always thought as a kid the ground was rising, but I think the idea is that the area around is collapsing onto the player. Conceptually, it's nice to see the team trying something so different. While yes, moving forwards with Sonic is fun, it's nice to see a different type of traversal played around with here. There's a lot of minor platforming, and because the stage has no death pits, that means it all feels very fair, and the team can get away with all of this traversal that requires much more jumping. In a way, it actually reminds me a little bit of Marble Zone from Sonic 1, which is maybe why this is named Marble Garden Zone, as there's a lot more stopping and starting than many other Sonic stages might have, with plenty of obstacles in the way. The team also did a great job at making this feel like a maze. Whenever I play the stage, as I honestly haven't memorized the layout, unless there's a signpost indicating the way to go, I'm never fully sure of the proper direction, as that could be any way, up, down, left, or right, other than where you were coming from. Add to that the fact that you might be searching for giant rings at the same time, with Act 1 having a whopping 8 giant rings in it alone, and you are very likely to be combing through this stage for a while, especially your first time playing. And I think that's where I feel a little mixed on this stage. As there are so many possible routes to go through and explore, I get to a point, personally, where the stage starts to overstay its welcome. I think most of the individual challenges are handled well, and I do like having a stage that actually requires genuine platforming mixed in, but I do get to a point during some of my playthroughs where I think, I'm still here? I also think there's a distinct lack of challenge to this stage, and because of how forgiving all of the challenges are, it makes me feel like I can sleep through this stage a little bit. There are certain obstacles that can crush you, and that's where most of the challenge lays with me, where I'd accidentally speed into one of these without thinking. I don't particularly love the top mechanic, as sometimes it's required for traversal and breaking through certain walls forwards. If you lose the top or progress to a point where you need a top but don't have it, that means you have to retraverse back to wherever the top might be in order to use it. That does, in a way, introduce a very light puzzle element to the stage, which is fine, but I've never found the top particularly fun to utilize and prefer Sonic's normal movement. These record machines, as I'm calling them, that players spin to create paths, well, without them, the path forward would simply be there. So all you're really doing here is stopping the spin dash for a moment, and then there's the exact same outcome. This would be more interesting if it was always used for alternate optional routes, but to simply create the normal path forwards, you're really just stopping for a moment and there's no actual challenge to it. The ones that have pulleys that pull the player up, I think is a great and potentially interesting mechanic, and I actually think this one could have potentially been utilized more with even more variety around its challenges. There could have been certain pulleys that also pull players straight up, and now there would be more tools at the developer's disposal to really mix up the challenges. When Robotnik destroys the stage and it all starts to collapse, it definitely creates a unique sense of urgency. Although it's not particularly challenging, likely because this game is meant for gamers with a very wide skill set, and if this was too difficult, it could turn off a certain subsect of Sonic 3 players. If you make it to the end of the section quickly, the reward is waiting for the stage to catch up to you, so it does feel like there should have been some way for more advanced players to skip the waiting portion. What all of this boils down to is a stage that, honestly, ends up being a little forgettable to me. There's nothing here that stands out to me as being terrible, and I do like some of the ideas presented here, and you know what, I really appreciate the team trying something different. But there's also nothing here that stands out to me that I love, and the stage sort of drags. For reaching the end of Marble Garden Zone Act 1, players will face off against the Tunnelbot. The Tunnelbot will drill into the ceiling, causing stalactites to fall that can hurt the player, then drill down and attempt to slam down, attacking the player, rinse and repeat. If the player has a shield, it will deflect the stalactites, making the boss's primary attacks completely pointless. The drills serve as a spot the player can't touch, but it's easy enough to jump into the Tunnelbot, making for a very simple boss fight. Because the Tunnelbot drills into the ceiling, that does make it somewhat reminiscent to the Egg Digger of Sonic 2 due to the drills and stalactites, but the boss fight is far easier due to how the stalactites work. If players have a shield, as I mentioned, in Sonic 3 that completely negates the attack. But even on top of that, the boss arena is much larger in Sonic 3, which automatically means players have a little more time to react to and avoid the falling stalactites. I think the drop speed of the stalactites is actually faster in Sonic 3 to compensate for the higher ceiling, but I still think the added arena size makes these easier to avoid. On top of that, the Egg Digger will cause far more stalactites to fall. This boss is so simple, it almost feels out of place here, as it's not really ramping up the challenge of the previous sub-bosses. Again, as I keep on saying, Sonic isn't a game about combat, so I don't expect elaborate or challenging battles, but I do wonder if this one teeters a little bit on too simple, especially given shields deflect the danger of the stalactites. Taking a quick break before fighting off against the Drill Mobile, now that we're halfway through the stages of Sonic 3, I think this would be a good time to talk about the overall level design philosophy of Sonic 3 and how it compares to prior games. I've touched on it quite a bit when mentioning each stage, but Sonic 3's stages are both much larger than we've seen before, and also much more about exploration, frequently requiring players to stop and change directions, without having as much of a straightforward path as most of the levels from the prior Sonic games. There's much more required verticality here, with players often required to somehow platform upwards before being dropped into a new sequence, and with that, the game often feels more like it's about speed bursts than necessarily a constant flow of speed. While Sonic 2 sometimes touched on this type of level design, it feels more pronounced throughout most of the stages in Sonic 3, and with the added hidden giant rings and walls, players are highly incentivized to explore further than what route will simply take them to the end. Even though players will be rapping back and forth a lot, the Sonic 3 team smartly included plenty of sections that will see Sonic flying forwards, still ensuring players get to feel that sense of Sonic's true speed. Every zone includes large ramps or obstacles players will be running down without interruption, so there's always some point that you're guaranteed to pick up speed. Even Marble Garden Zone, which doesn't necessarily have a normal large ramp, includes sections where players are practically falling down giant, nearly vertical ramps with a chance to jump off. So I think what you start to get, and the way these stages feel, to me, are stages that really combine the design philosophies of different stages from Sonic 1 merged together. You get the speed and multiple routes of Green Hill Zone, and the obstacles and back and forth routing of Marble Zone. In some ways, it feels like a best of. The team has really discovered what they feel like works for a Sonic game, and how to include obstacles, but make them not so obnoxious that they completely detract and slow down the pace of the game. The real question though, and I think what's going to determine a lot of your personal enjoyment, will be if you enjoy the larger stages with a larger focus on exploration. Because for some players, that's going to be more to love and a true Sonic world to explore. But it loses that quick pace of Sonic 2 with levels that can feel like they drag if you're not a big fan of them. If you don't like Oil Ocean Zone in Sonic 2, you can blaze through it fairly fast. If you don't like Carnival Night Zone, well, you're going to be stuck in it for a while, like it or not. I imagine, given Sonic 3 and Knuckles' immense popularity, most players fall into the camp of enjoying the larger stages with the higher emphasis on exploration and good balance of speed and obstacles. But where do you stand? For reaching the end of Marble Garden Zone Act 2, players will face off against the Drill Mobile. This is an interesting fight as it takes players to the sky and sees players required to fight the machine while Tails is flying and holding up Sonic, or flying on his own when playing as Tails solo. Robotnik will first use his Drill Mobile to further obliterate Marble Garden Zone and destroy the ground beneath players, but also gives players ample opportunity to lay hits in that do count towards depleting his total health, outside of the final blow. In the air, the Drill Mobile will attack with its attached drill in one of the directions, coming in from off-screen, then fly off-screen again, before repeating this. As Sonic, players will have to jump off of Tails to bounce onto Robotnik in a safe spot without touching the drill. As Tails, players will need to fly up into the Drill Mobile from below, as you can attack it with Tails, but not by dropping down onto him. The Sonic battle works incredibly well as a totally unique fight that sees players needing to avoid the Drill Mobile in the air and properly time out and aim a jump attack. If the player bounces and falls off screen, Tails will chase down to once again pick back up Sonic, but players can also bounce right back into Tails' arms to prevent this from happening, which is a nice touch. The Tails solo battle though, I think works, but it's not clear, or at least I didn't find it clear, that the way to injure the Drill Mobile is by attacking from below. So I think there's an issue of clarity in that regard. This is a very different type of fight than anything else we'll see, and it is a little slow due to the nature of Robotnik only having one attack, meaning players get one opportunity to attack before he flies off screen again. But as this is such a unique mechanic, I don't think stepping up the difficulty would have been a good idea, especially considering controlling Tails in the air is a little floaty and not extremely precise. It's cool that the team decided to use this brand new mechanic of Tails flying while holding Sonic, and actually use it as a major mechanic for a boss battle. It's also a nice story device that shows Sonic and Tails working together as a team. For defeating the Drill Mobile, Tails will fly Sonic down right into Carnival Night Zone. Carnival Night Zone is the obstacle-heavy course of Sonic 3, with all sorts of gimmicks that will propel Sonic back and forth in various directions. From balloons that will bounce Sonic up, to bumpers and gongs that will shoot Sonic forwards, normal bumpers, spinning records the player can run around, similar to the very same mechanic introduced in Sonic 1, fans that will keep Sonic up in the air, and more. In a way, this feels like Sonic 3's take on Spring Yard Zone of Sonic 1, Casino Night Zone of Sonic 2, or Collision Chaos of Sonic CD, as there are so many things that could propel the player in various directions. There are also spiky traps everywhere, with plenty of opportunities for players to get injured, and more importantly, there are multiple sections with crushers, which is where the vast majority of my deaths come from. So let's take a look at this as a bumper stage. Like Casino Night Zone, Carnival Night Zone is filled with bumpers everywhere, but unlike Casino Night Zone, there's actual danger. Many of the bumpers or springs are laid out as traps that are meant to shoot you directly into spikes. So it makes this stage need to be played a little more cautiously, for better or worse. It means that Carnival Night Zone is a stage that's about short and quick bursts of speed, as players will need to speed through certain obstacles or propel themselves properly on certain bumpers, but then quickly stop or slow down to assess how to handle the next obstacle in front of them. Unlike Sonic 2, where players generally know, go left to right, Sonic 3's level design regularly sees players going in all different directions, with each one potentially being the correct path forwards. So that means with all of the bumpers and springs, it can be a little more difficult to understand the correct pathing, as it's not as straightforward. Although I do think, as a general rule of thumb, it's easy enough to say, just keep going in whatever direction the level and its walls take you in, and you're going to be good. Carnival Night Zone is also very specific about closing players into rooms. There's one-way launchers and doors that will close directly behind Sonic, so even though on the surface the stage can be disorienting, there should always be a clear direction because the game is consistently acting to ensure players can't get too lost. Also, on par with Sonic 3, Carnival Night Zone is a massive stage, so that does mean if you don't like this stage, you're going to be stuck here for a long time, and if you do like this stage, well, that means you get more to love. I think there are some really good ideas within Carnival Night Zone. For example, these balloons that pop players up and can lead to hidden areas are a great concept. It's a fun mechanic, but I do feel like this could have been used for genuine forward traversal in a fun way, rather than typically being an optional mechanic that leads to optional areas. These fans that float players up had generally been used to try and traverse upwards, but here, in Carnival Night Zone, they're instead typically placed where players want to drop down, and players will need to find the gaps within to do so, oftentimes while avoiding bumpers or balloons that can take them right back up. It's a nice inversion on the normal challenge, and the team smartly mixed it with other elements from the stage. The record spinners that originated from Sonic 1 are still a good concept, and are occasionally used in interesting ways that require players use them to move forwards. While there are plenty of obstacles in Carnival Night Zone, a lot of times players can, and should, use those to their advantage. Even one of the enemies, the Clamor, can be used as a bumper to propel players forwards. While this is a stage filled to the brim with springs and bumpers, the team also interwove large ramps, speed sections, and ramps that require spin dashing to make a nice maze filled with different types of obstacles. I think one of my main hiccups with this stage comes down to what I feel like is an overuse of crushers. I don't particularly like when I'm running forwards and an obstacle I didn't see will suddenly crush me, and I have had moments that feel a little unfair as I somehow got wedged into something unsafe. That does speak to this stage being about quick and short bursts of speed, rather than something players should be entirely speeding through. So from that design standpoint, these crushers make sense and happen to fit within the general idea of the stage, but I still don't like them here. Probably the biggest point of contention with Carnival Night Zone are these spinning wheels. At least that's the name the Sonic Wiki gave these. These spinning wheels can be controlled by players standing on the wheel, then pressing up and down to create momentum, and pendulum these up and down more and more. Players can spring off of these when there's upwards momentum, and as players control these with up and down, it means that these can be used to block the path forwards, and players will need to press up and down to eventually open the way. So, partway through Carnival Night Zone Act 2, players will come to a room where they're trapped, and the only way forwards is to use one of these spinning wheels by pressing up and down on it. So, this is an interesting game design question. The team came up with this spinning wheel mechanic, and they want players to learn how to interact with it. The only way to really do this in-game is to absolutely require players learn the mechanics somehow, and trapping players into a tiny room with this drum means that players are absolutely forced to learn, because there's nothing else they can do in the room. And that's what Sonic Team chose here, with the players needing to control the drum to eventually lower them so they can escape. But the mechanic is so far beyond Sonic's normal controls that it leads to the question, how many players figure this out, and how long does it take them to figure it out? And to that end, as it's only a small mechanic barely used in the stage, is it even worth the trouble? It's not like this is part of Sonic's main moveset here. I was curious, by the way, and the way to control these is not in the manual, so nobody can give the excuse of, oh, don't you know? You're supposed to read the manual. For my part, if nothing else about Carnival Night Zone, I remember this room, because like many other people, I got absolutely stuck here when I was a kid and incredibly confused about what to do. I'd try jumping up, it wouldn't work. I'd think, maybe the way to control this is momentum from jumping, so I tried jumping in sequence with this barrel, but it didn't work, or give me enough momentum to drop low enough to escape. Even when I did press down, I don't think I initially realized this could continually be used in conjunction with up to control the wheel. I think I discovered the correct way as a total fluke, and remember excitedly telling my brothers I'd done it. So, the problem really comes down to, everything up until now about every Sonic game is based on the action button. Yes, spin dashing requires players hold down and crouch, but that's it. Otherwise, players are pressing left, right, or the action button, or up in the case of Sonic CD for the super peel out. So there's no reason players should think, I'm standing on this object that's spinning me, the solution is to press up and down in sequence, and that will control the thing I'm standing on, because that's never how you control anything in the game. I think trapping players in a room and forcing them to learn a mechanic is okay, but the issue here isn't forcing players to learn a mechanic, is that the mechanic is so far removed from the normal controls, many players won't realize this, or it will take so long to realize that it takes away from the fun. And all of this for a mechanic that is almost never used in the stage. To that point, might as well just have it be a fun optional thing players can learn, or it needed to have a change in how it actually functioned. I'm still trapped in this room, by the way. I've never gotten out. So how does Carnival Night Zone stack up against our other bumper zones from prior games? Well, for the most part, I actually like many of the challenges that are in Carnival Night Zone, and think it works pretty well as a short burst cautionary level. But I do think that Collision Chaos still tops out as my personal favorite of all of these bumpy levels. The other thing, for me, with Carnival Night Zone, is that I don't personally like the circus aesthetic of the level, or the music. It was done fine, Brad Buxer did a fine job. Again, creepy circus music, not my particular jam. So that makes this a stage I'm never particularly excited to play, but I do have fun with here and there, as I do like a lot of the individual ideas in the stage. As I mentioned with Carnival Night Zone, it is the stage where I find myself most likely to get crushed and lose lives. So something that's worth re-exploring for Sonic 3 is how the save system affects the lives, continue, and game over system of Sonic 3. In prior games, Sonic had a limited number of lives and continues. If players ran out of lives, they'd use a continue. If they ran out of continues, they were SOL and it was back to the start of the game. But with Sonic 3, now that there's a save system, how does that work? Is your save just deleted if you get a game over? And the answer is no. You now have infinite tries thanks to the save system. If you run out of lives and use a continue, you'll start back at where you were and with 3 lives. If you run out of lives and continues and get a game over, your punishment is being pushed back to the title screen. Then, when you select your save, you'll have 1 life, but you'll still be at the same zone you were at before, although have to start back at Act 1. So this is another element that drastically reduces the overall difficulty of Sonic 3 compared to Sonic's 1 and 2. The positive of this is that, obviously, it makes it so more players can complete the game, and less frustration overall. The negative, though, is that it means continues mean far less than they did before. Yes, a continue can still help you, and basically acts as a pack of 3 lives, but the punishment for failure is so far diminished, it also diminishes the value in getting one. This also lowers the stakes in general for losing a life. So that's where this can be a potentially divisive change, as it lowers the intensity of the game while opening it up for more players. I do think this is really going to only affect your first time playing the game, or maybe first couple times playing the game. Honestly, I can't remember the last time I even used a continue in Sonic 3, so the amount this affects my enjoyment of the game either way is none. I don't think about the live system in Sonic 3 at all. That might also speak to Sonic 3 being an overall easier game than Sonic's 1 and 2, especially with the power of the new shields, the additional bonus stages, and the lack of instant death challenge sequences. And that might also have been the point, as Sonic and Knuckles expand Sonic 3 so much, and I think that's where the true challenges start to come in. But without Sonic and Knuckles, Sonic 3 certainly stands as the easiest of the 3 original Sonic games, and the way the save system functions only furthers that. Granted, I do think Sonic CD is easier than Sonic 3, but I mentioned that in my Sonic CD video. Make it through Carnival Night Zone Act 1, and players will reach the Bowling Spin sub-boss. The battle takes place over a series of destructible blocks. The Bowling Spin's main attack is shooting out its spiked top, and once that hits the ground, it will destroy a tile below it, eventually leading to an insta-death pit below. The Bowling Spin cannot be injured by Sonic directly, but rather has to be injured by its own top. So in a gameplay shift, players will need to jump into the Bowling Spin, which will cause its screw to open up, and then simply wait for its own offensive top to ram into it. That makes this a battle that's really about avoiding the obstacles more than anything else. It can also lead to a bunch of waiting around, as once players open up the bowling pin's screw, there's nothing they can do other than wait. But while I have had that happen, overall, I do think this is a great change of pace. Because there's no true attacking, it allows players to focus on the actual obstacles, and it does still keep this simple enough to not be such a major step up in its challenge. For making it through Carnival Night Zone Act 2, players will reach Dr. Robotnik in his Graviton Mobile. For the Graviton Mobile, Robotnik will attempt to hover over Sonic before dropping a giant marble ball from the bottom of his ship. The ball will roll and bounce, creating its own unique obstacle. From there, Robotnik will hover over the ball, and a series of smaller conductors will spin around him, with electricity shooting down around the larger ball, creating a magnet that will pull players in. After this attack is done, Robotnik will drop down to pick back up his marble ball, fly back up, and then repeat the same attack pattern. The main thing that always threw me off about this fight is that, thanks to his electric conductors, the entire bottom portion of the Graviton Mobile is protected, and players can't attack it unless they have iframes or use the Insta-Shield. Outside of this though, the Graviton Mobile is a fairly simple boss fight once you understand it. If players understand the electricity creates a magnet, all they need to do is run to avoid it, and the dropping ball is also simple enough to avoid when players understand the attack. That makes this fight feel a bit more like stopping and waiting a lot, unless you're like me and get impatient and simply iframe through the whole thing, which you can easily do. I do think that makes the Graviton Mobile one of the less interesting fights. If you play it normally, it feels like a patience game, and iframing through the fight doesn't particularly feel fun to me, as you're not doing much more than jumping up and trusting you'll collect your rings. There's no interesting strategy here I'm aware of, although I know the lightning shield can protect players from the electricity. It really is just waiting around. For defeating the Graviton Mobile, players will hop into a cannon and blast off into Ice Cap Zone. The stage starts with an absolutely iconic moment of Sonic snowboarding down a mountain before crashing into a wall. Or Tails, just crashing into that wall. While the player isn't actually doing much, it is a fun moment. Players can jump and collect rings, but really, it's more like an in-game cutscene. Which I suppose leads to a broader topic about Sonic 3's use of these in-game cutscenes. We talked about transitionary cutscenes, but unlike Sonic's 1, 2, or CD, there are moments like this that are interspersed into the gameplay, but are really meant as wow factor moments. Angel Island Zone, as the other primary example, has a moment where Sonic is running through the jungle as a ship drops bombs behind him. Yes, players are controlling Sonic, and if you stop running, you'll fall back into one of these bombs and can get injured or die. But all you're really doing is holding right. The snowboard sequence in Ice Cap Zone is fun, but you don't have to press a single button, will automatically collect rings, and then it's over. Defeat the ball shooter in Launchpad Zone, and players will always need to watch a short cutscene of Sonic riding Robotnik's mobile machine up to fight him, and getting knocked back briefly by Knuckles before the final fight aboard a rocket ship. Even if you lose, you'll still have to watch this again. To be honest, I never really thought too deeply about these moments other than thinking they were fun and brief, and added a little story or break to the gameplay. But after I finished my Sonic 2 video, it was regularly recommended to me to watch Sparky's World's video, Sonic CD, The Unsung Masterpiece. And after I finished my own Sonic CD video, and received plenty more recommendations, I did so. It's a nearly 8-hour-long love letter to Sonic CD, And if you love the game, it is very well done, and I'm sure this video will absolutely speak to you. Either way, a portion of the video was in him discussing certain elements he found bothered him about Sonic 3 compared to Sonic CD, and why Sonic CD ended up overcoming Sonic 3 as his favorite game. One of those critiques was these in-game cutscenes, because after you replay Sonic 3 for the nth time, you are once again watching the exact same thing where you're not actually doing anything. That is a fair criticism, and I do think it's worth bringing up here as a potential negative consequence of including these little playable cutscenes. Unlike a traditional cutscene, where you could simply have players click a button to skip it, that doesn't really work here. But the pro of this type of playable cutscene is that, even if it's not skippable, it's far more engaging because you are still playing the game, even if you're not doing very much. And the transitional cutscenes, like flying to the final Robotnik fight, serves as a nice bit of connective tissue. The other question I'd have though is, how many times do you need to replay Sonic 3 in order for these cutscenes to start to become that big of an issue where it truly affects your enjoyment one way or another? I've been playing Sonic 3 and Sonic & Knuckles ever since they first released. I definitely played it more frequently as a kid as part of my rotation of games I'd play, but I'm not a speedrunner, and especially nowadays, it's not like I replay this game on repeat on a regular basis. That's not to insult people who do, these are great games. The point is, more so, I played these games a lot as a kid and still occasionally play them, and these cutscenes never bothered me. If anything, I always enjoyed the little moments that they created. So I do feel like the downside of this for repeat playthroughs is probably going to only affect a very small minority of the Sonic 3 players, and I think the upsides likely outweigh the downsides for most of the player base. So we've snowboarded down a mountain, if you're Sonic, and are now in Ice Cap Zone. Like every zone, Ice Cap Zone is split into two distinct acts, with the first act taking place inside a giant ice cavern, while the second act takes place mostly outside amongst glaciers. The reason I bring this up here though, is Acts 1 and 2 are a lot more distinct in the case of Ice Cap Zone. Act 1 is a set of start and stop puzzles. You'll mostly be either pushing and riding giant ice blocks that will break the way forwards for you, or spin dashing against these platforms that swing up once you hit them, allowing you to platform and progress vertically. Act 2 is then a giant roller coaster stage, somewhat more reminiscent of something like Starlight Zone from Sonic 1. The entire top portion of the stage is a non-stop sequence of downward ramps, loops, and ramps that will launch players back up, and there are these swinging platforms players can use their weight and momentum to jump on, and eventually launch far into the air. In fact, the functionality of these are exactly how, as a kid, I thought the spinning wheels of Carnival Night Zone would act. A truly notable element to Ice Cap Zone Act 1 is, because you're traveling so far vertically with the game's swinging platform system, falling off will be much more punishing than a traditional stage because of the amount of progress you can quickly lose with a single mistake. If I'm not mistaken, I think Ice Cap Zone is one of the most popular stages from Sonic 3, and as a kid, it was definitely one of my favorite stages. But I'm not sure if I feel as positively about it now, and specifically Act 1. The swinging vertical platforms are a nice concept, and it's nice to see something that, at times, really requires the spin dash to get momentum. But there are so many of these in Act 1, it starts to make the stage feel a little too slow to me, and at times, a little tedious. I do like the concept, and each challenge on its own is a good little sequence, but it feels like perhaps mixing elements from Acts 1 and 2 together would have helped break this up a little bit, and stop it from becoming as monotonous to me, personally, in Act 1. The ice block sequences from Act 1 are a fun little puzzle, as players will be infinitely dropping until they figure out where to go. These moments are short, but they feel unique in the way they're handled, and I like the way they change things up. Another element to Act 1 I think is worth critiquing is this one spot that has two crushing glaciers. Players will need to time out when to properly fall through a gap so they don't get crushed above them, and then quickly escape before one of these giant ice blocks slams down on them from the rest of their cycle. There's no visual indicator these are going to both smash the ground, especially considering the glacier on the right doesn't raise as high as the glacier on the left. So my instinct told me, hey, the glacier on the left is unsafe when you're above it, but safe when you're below it. And the glacier on the right is safe when you're above it, but unsafe when you're below it. And I was wrong. Both of these will smash you if you're below them, which came across as a little unfair to me as there wasn't much way to assess this. Now, there is. If you listen to the sound design, you can hear both glaciers make smashing noises when they hit the ground. But I do question how many people actually notice and realize that specific tell. I like the challenge itself, and look, once you mess up to this once, you'll know how it works and can then properly do the challenge. But maybe there should have been a closer checkpoint for that reason. Dying here sets players back to the start of the stage, as there haven't been any checkpoints outside of the beginning up to this point, and you've already made it through an ice block ride and a whole segment of those swinging platforms. Act 2, on the other hand, is incredibly simple. It's a stage that's designed for players to breeze through, and the only true challenge exists if players let themselves end up within and stay within the bottom route. If players are in the bottom route, it's easy enough to get out, so it's not like this is a forced challenge. So, Act 2 comes as a stage that's purely about speeding through and having fun, and it's probably the only act in all of Sonic 3 that's like this, and I'd actually call it the most simple stage of Sonic 3. That's not an immediately bad thing, mind you. It's a bit like how Sonic 1 had the much simpler Starlight Zone just before the final act, or Sonic CD has the much simpler Stardust Speedway before the final act, and Sonic 2 has the more relaxed Sky Chase Zone before the final act. It serves as a short and sweet intermission before the challenges are about to ramp up again. So yes, Sonic 3 could have taken that idea I threw out there, where Acts 1 and 2 could have combined their ideas and challenges, but by doing it this way, they do create a nice rhythm to the game where you get the calm before the storm. For making it through Ice Cap Zone Act 1, players will reach the sub-boss Big Icedus. Big Icedus will magnetize a cluster of ice chunks that will spin around it with the sound of a gong. It then swoops down to the bottom center of the screen and back up to the opposite side of where it started. Afterwards, it will launch its ice chunks into the air, leaving it defenseless, with the ice chunks falling from the sky. And repeat. The ice chunks spinning around the Big Icedus act as a shield, but like similar bosses we've seen from prior Sonic games who have a spinning shield, the shield will rotate, leaving the sub-boss open to attacks at certain points in its cycle. In a way, the Big Icedus is somewhat reminiscent of Marble Hill Zone's Tunnelbot. While the Tunnelbot only went up and down with its attack, it would then create obstacles that fell from the top of the screen. Now, we have a slightly more advanced version of the same thing, as the Big Icedus also drops obstacles from the sky, but its swooping attack is harder to avoid, until the player knows what it is, and that it does this every single time. That does make this sub-boss a little less interesting, because it does the same pattern on repeat. But I always like these spinning shields, as they create fun timing challenges for the player to hit them when the shield opens up. Technically, newer players don't have to do that, but I think it adds to the fun of the fight to have these small openings for the players who do want to go for them. As the Big Icedus is generally in the range of the player, this is a very easy sub-boss to destroy, as you can use good old iframes to injure the boss when you probably shouldn't be able to. So that does detract from the boss fight a little bit for me, as there's so much room for error. Make it through Ice Cap Zone Act 2, and players will reach Robotnik in his Freezer Mobile. This contraption sees Robotnik lower a device that shoots out frost gas to the left or right out of the contraption. He'll also shoot frost downwards from his mobile machine directly onto the contraption. The contraption acts as a platform players can jump on in order to reach and attack Robotnik, as he's otherwise too high up to reach. Unless you have the lightning shield, which will completely nullify any challenge to this boss fight. Anyways, this downwards attack is the one that's meant to stop players from jumping on the platform and easily defeating him. The way the pattern works is that the Frost Blast will fire left, down, right, down, left, etc. Although, after a certain period of time, this will become random. I don't think this needed to become random. These fights never typically last that long, at least the way I play, and the randomness can lead to it potentially feeling unfair. The actual normal pattern can be fun to dodge and attack through, so it feels like the team should have been content with that. If Sonic or Tails are hit by the Frost Blast, it will freeze them in place for a moment before they break out, losing their rings. After players hit Robotnik enough times, his attachment will break off, and he'll hover back and forth shooting the frost attack below him while freezing air sputters behind him, meaning, at that point, all players need to do is jump into him a couple times. I think the starting portion to this fight is an interesting challenge. When I did wait around for the random portion to test it, as I never let this fight drag on this long normally, it was easy enough to safely make it through and attack Robotnik, but with a slight added intensity. Although, as I said, when this becomes random, I still wouldn't call it hard, but it does muddy the challenge to a point where it feels less direct and less fair, as there's no proper way to predict when to try and attack. It's also pretty funny how much the Lightning Shield completely trivializes this fight, which there's a good chance players will have, as Lightning Shields are scattered everywhere throughout Icecap Zone Act 2. And when you think about it, the players who were able to hold onto the Lightning Shield are probably the ones who are least likely to need its help for the boss fight, while the ones who couldn't manage to do this are going to only be extra punished for it. That does then reward players who play well throughout the level, which is something the game has taught players anyways by this point, but it is worth noting. Overall, I do like this fight and the intended challenge. For defeating the Freezer Mobile, players will tunnel through the snow and end up at our final stage for Sonic 3, Launch Base Zone. While Launch Base Zone is only halfway through Sonic 3 and Knuckles, as it's the finale of Sonic 3, that means that everything here is ramped up to make for the most challenging stage so far in Sonic 3, really combining all of the ideas we've seen in one culmination. There are plenty of interesting obstacles players will need to tackle, such as giant rotating platforms which Sonic will loop around with enemies on both sides, and distinct areas above and below. There are traps and hazards scattered everywhere, with specific devices that will launch Sonic from one spot to another. All of this is within a giant maze-like stage, which will see Sonic traveling back and forth from one direction to another, once again showcasing that exploratory element to Sonic 3. There are even pipes with windows in them, which turn out to be hidden routes players can take, once again enhancing that idea players should be exploring. Additionally, there are elevators that will take Sonic from one location to another, really helping to disorient and ensure the platforming isn't simply left to right, but consistently changing directions. Like Icecap Zone, Launch Base Zone is much more distinct between its two acts. Act 1 is filled with buildings that will see players stopping and solving mini-puzzles that allow them to progress forwards. However, instead, Act 2 is filled with a giant pipe system that creates massive ramps and that classic roller coaster Sonic feel. Due to the number of obstacles, Launch Base Zone is a proper step up in difficulty, but it never gets so challenging that it becomes a roadblock. Sonic CD asides, I definitely call this the easiest final zone against Sonic's 1 or 2. That probably speaks to the fact the team was hoping to have more levels, and eventually planned for this with the upcoming Sonic and Knuckles. So to that end, in the full picture, Launch Base Zone ends up being more of the end of Act 1 of a 2-act play. So it's a rising of tension and the climax of Act 1, but not the ultimate climax to the entire story. The whole stage feels like a fantastic mix of minor challenges with bursts of speed and exploratory moments. The stage never drags, partially thanks to just how much it changes in Act 2 with its pipe system, and I think Launch Base Zone really does take what works from all of its prior stages, but with a properly adjusted difficulty. So overall, this feels like a fantastic send-off stage for Sonic 3. Something else I find to be pretty notable about Launch Base Zone, and this goes for all of the stages in Sonic 3, are a distinct lack of insta-death pits. In fact, boss fights aside, I'm fairly certain the only two zones that include insta-death pits are Icecap Zone Act 2 and Hydrocity Zone Act 2, and that one you have to go out of your way to find. After Sonic 1, the team really began to limit the amount of insta-death pits that were in the Sonic series, and I think for good reason. While they do make good challenges, the issue becomes a player readability one. Players will be moving so fast, and there are so many alternate routes below players, it can be difficult to properly communicate when there's a route that will be below the player if they drop, or an insta-death pit. Sonic and Knuckles has more insta-death pits, but notably, those are in zones where the player is high up in the air, like Flying Battery Zone or Sky Sanctuary Zone, and yeah, it makes sense that falling off the side of a giant plane will be an insta-death pit. The main point though is that this feels like a further evolution of the team understanding what works and doesn't work in Sonic, and why. For making it through Launch Base Zone Act 1, players will reach the Twin Hammer sub-boss. After Robotnik unleashes it from its storage container, 2 spiked maces will protrude from its body and start spinning around it as it travels towards the player. It will then hover over the player in range of its attack to be able to hit. Whenever the player jumps, the twin hammer will attempt to float up and out of range, although at a slower speed than the player, still allowing the player to get an attack in. And once the player hits the twin hammer will be knocked up and potentially out of range for an immediate second attack. That makes this a sub-boss fight that's mostly about timing, with players needing to time out when they can safely jump to hit the twin hammer, and one where players have to be on the offensive, as this will also knock the boss, and therefore attack, away from them. Notably, while the retracted spiked mace on the bottom can still hurt players if they jump directly into it, the Insta-Shield allows Sonic to hurt the boss anyways in this moment. After enough hits, one of the arms will break off, making the second half of the fight significantly easier. Like the spinning shield of the big Icedus, this is a timing mechanic I enjoy, and I think works really well for the Sonic games. And in particular, I think it's a great bit of design for the twin hammer to be knocked upwards after being attacked, meaning players really have to play into this mechanic. It's a fitting final sub-boss, as it requires the most out of players compared to the other sub-bosses we've seen so far. Make it through Launch Base Zone Act 2, and players will reach the ball shooter. This is actually the first part of a 3-part boss, and we'll see Robotnik raising up out of reach from the player, then launching 2 different giant balls at Sonic and/or Tails. He does this by raising a platform and having a ball shoot out above or below. He'll then lower the platform. The pattern is simple. A ball will launch from the top, then bottom, then top, etc. The top ball can be avoided by hanging out underneath the platform or jumping over it from the top of a hill on the left side of the boss arena. Meanwhile, the bottom ball will need to be jumped over. If the ball explodes after being shot out, that's the end of it. However, if it doesn't, it will roll back down the hill, meaning players will have to avoid the second half to this projectile. The platform itself is what players will need to use to jump up and actually reach and attack Robotnik. Once players understand the fight, it's an incredibly simple pattern, so there really isn't too much difficulty to it. Although, you can also attempt to use the platform while it's both extending out and retracting to get more attacks in, which is where I personally find the enjoyment in this fight. Especially since, without doing this, the fight can drag on. I do like that higher skill cap element to the boss fight though, and I think in a vacuum, this boss fight is fine. My only real critique of it is that it's a somewhat long fight, even if you are using the platform as much as possible, and this is only part 1 of a 3-phase boss fight. So it can feel overly long before the true fight starts, especially considering it's not particularly challenging. I think that just adds to this feeling unnecessarily long. Again, in a vacuum, I think this is a fun concept. For destroying the ball shooter, players will find one of Robotnik's flying machines and hop in to chase after Robotnik. I always loved seeing Sonic on this, as it really feels like him taking charge, and a diversion away from what you're used to seeing. This will lead players to a platform on the bottom of a giant rocket ship blasting off, where they'll once again face off against Robotnik, this time in his beam rocket. The beam rocket fight sees Robotnik flying up or down one of the sides of the arena in his machine that consists of 3 parts legoed on top of each other. The bottom 2 pieces are beam shooters, which have a generous tell as they charge up, meaning players will need to hop over or stay underneath these beams when they shoot out, depending on where Robotnik is when this activates. His weak spot is the top piece, but this time around, there's a little spike rotating around players will have to watch out for that will occasionally guard Robotnik and hurt players upon touching it. This makes for an extra bit of timing, with players needing to be somewhat cautious of attacking, and perhaps more importantly, means players won't be able to hop on Robotnik and simply bounce while Sonic obliterates him. I would actually guess that's the true purpose of this, as that would eliminate any challenge to the boss fight, and as this is the final fight, the team probably didn't want players to completely cheese it. That said, if you're playing as Sonic, you can use the Insta-Shield to nullify the spike. Granted, it still does serve that purpose of preventing the players from non-stop bouncing on his head. As Robotnik will switch directions, and the beam activates at different times, with players needing to watch when they can actually jump, this fight becomes much more interesting to me than the ball shooter, because that randomization does mean you'll have to stay on your toes and consistently be engaged. For defeating the beam rocket, Robotnik will fly away as the sky becomes dark and the final phase of the fight begins. Robotnik will fly down past players in his big arm, and the true final battle of Sonic 3 begins. The big arm is not only my favorite fight in Sonic 3, but one of my favorite fights in all of the classic Sonic games. The big arm is a machine that has spikes on top, meaning players can't normally jump onto Robotnik, and giant arms in front. That means, in order to actually hurt the big arm, players will need to jump into the opening below his spiked helmet and above the big arms. If one of the arms grabs Sonic or Tails, Robotnik will fly up with them and then slam them down onto the ground. From there, the big arm only really has 3 attacks. His first attack sequence is flying horizontally and slightly up from off-screen, attempting to grab players in its arms. For this attack, the player is meant to jump over his arms and hit him within the small opening. If you don't understand how to use the Insta-Shield offensively, this is going to be your only real chance to hurt Robotnik. But I find it to be a really fun timing challenge. At this point, players have been platforming through the entire game, so this is really testing your jump accuracy along with your reflexes. The big arm's second attack sequence sees Robotnik hover back and forth across the top of the screen, then drop down below players with his spikes protruding above the platform Sonic and Tails are on. He'll then once again hover back and forth, this time with players needing to jump and avoid his spiked helmet. What I'm calling his third attack is, at the end of this sequence, Robotnik will stop, then raise up diagonally across the screen. This is another opportunity to get an attack in, but much more difficult to properly aim as he's rising up so quickly, and honestly, probably not worth the effort. This alone, with this jump timing challenge, is something I always enjoyed, but what elevates the fight even further is that advanced players who understand how to use the Insta-Shield have a major opportunity for more attacks during the attack sequence where Robotnik flies back and forth along the ground. Using the Insta-Shield, players can jump on Robotnik here, laying in far more attacks. It does somewhat trivialize the final boss fight, but I also view this as a more advanced mechanic newer players won't know how to properly utilize. So you get a final fight that asks players to really understand how to aim and target with their jump attack, while also asking players to properly jump and avoid danger. It's a platforming fight that's all about precise jumping. This fight is nowhere near as difficult as Sonic 2's Death Egg Robot. If players wanted to be safe in that fight, it was a ton of waiting around, and the stakes with 0 rings made for a regularly frustrating battle as the Death Egg Robot has such massive hitboxes. The fight is more challenging than Sonic 1's Egg Crusher, and feels better with its platforming. The Egg Crusher required players use their acceleration to get out of the way of multiple crushing devices, but because Sonic's acceleration is so slow, asking players to slowly accelerate away from a fast-moving obstacle doesn't particularly feel good or play to Sonic's strengths. Then, Sonic CD's final battle of the Egg Spinner is so simple that it's anticlimactic. While the big arm lacks the visual wow factor of the Death Egg Robot, the fight itself feels both more fair and fun, still requires accuracy, still contains a nice challenge to it, and the big arm does still feel menacing in its visual. So again, this is my favorite of the classic Sonic final boss fights so far, and probably my favorite Sonic boss fight so far, period. Defeat the big arm, and Robotnik will explode away as the platform Sonic is on will detach from the giant rocket. It slowly and safely starts falling back to the ground, although I'm not sure how, as Sonic will witness the Death Egg falling from the sky behind him and it exploding. Victory music will play as Sonic poses to the camera, then leaps off of the platform, and if players obtained all of the Chaos Emeralds, he'll fly into the screen as Super Sonic, giving players a thumbs up. And that's it. Not really much of an added reward for obtaining Super Sonic, although it's not entirely that much different from the added Chaos Emerald 100% reward of Sonic 2. Beat it without Super Sonic, and Sonic will still jump into and pose to the screen, just, with a different sprite. And cue the credits and Stranger in Moscow. I say that because the credits theme sounds almost identical to Michael Jackson's Stranger in Moscow, because, as I mentioned in the music section, both piano arrangements were written by Brad Buxer. In fact, I think it's fair to say, while all of the talk around Sonic 3's missing music and missing credit is around Michael Jackson, Really, Brad Buxer is the one who wrote and composed this music, and he fortunately does get credit here. So I think it's a bit of a shame that all of the Michael Jackson talk has taken away from what's really his contribution to the Sonic 3 score, and this credits theme is another fantastic one from him. On top of that, there's plenty of fantastic music in Sonic 3 and Knuckles not written by this team, and that also seems to get overshadowed by the Michael Jackson discussion. Anyways, there's nothing flashy about the credits here, and afterwards, a fun Sonic 3 logo appears, and that's it. The end. So now that we've gone through all of Sonic 3 without Knuckles, you have the gameplay experience that most people in the 90s first had with Sonic 3. There are elements that were likely drastically changed because of the decision to eventually add on Sonic and Knuckles, and ones that were made due to being forced to remove those levels from Sonic 3. Some examples include, when Sonic and Knuckles is attached to Sonic 3, players won't fight the Big Arm during the Sonic campaign in Launch Base Zone, but rather only square off against the Ball Shooter and Beam Rocket. That speaks to the Big Arm fight being added on much later in the process, once it was decided Launch Base Zone was definitely the final level, in order to make it more climactic. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that Flying Battery Zone from Sonic and Knuckles was originally going to appear much earlier in Sonic 3, and between Carnival Night Zone and Ice Cap Zone. And on a similar note, Mushroom Hill Zone, which is the first stage of Sonic and Knuckles, had to be reworked, as it was originally intended to be more challenging because, as a complete package, Mushroom Hill Zone would be the 7th or 8th stage, depending on if Flying Battery Zone had been where it was originally intended. The result of all of this is a much shorter Sonic 3 than was originally intended, and at the same time, I do wonder if Sonic 3 and Knuckles, as a combined package, is longer than what was originally intended. Thanks to the increased length of Sonic 3's levels and added on sub-bosses, Sonic 3 still feels like a decent-sized game on its own. However, combined, Sonic 3 and Knuckles is absolutely massive. I think the resulting Sonic 3, on its own, does feel like it's missing a stage or two. It's not as climactic as Sonic 2, where you end up flying onto the Death Egg, and you never discover what Knuckles' deal is. There are multiple sections that are clearly meant for Knuckles, but someone playing Sonic 3 when it first released would have had no idea this was the case, so there are instead these really mysterious sections that look like there should be more to it and feel unfinished on their own. It's the type of mysterious Easter egg that people would have made countless YouTube videos about had Sonic and Knuckles not ended up releasing, showcasing the point of these. The balance of Sonic 3 also feels somewhat compromised in a way. Nothing here is outright challenging, and while, sure, you could argue that Carnival Night Zone and Launch Base Zone are difficult, yes, they're the most challenging stages of Sonic 3, but compared to the prior games, Sonic 3 on its own never ramps up in the same way that Sonic's 1 or 2 did. Now, if you don't like the difficult stages of Sonic's 1, 2, or 3 in Knuckles, that's not a bad thing, but it does feel like this was a compromise that was made, because really, what do? You're hoping to make Sonic and Knuckles attached to Sonic 3 as a continuation, but then how hard does Sonic 3 become if Sonic and Knuckles is supposed to be the final stages? So I think the result we see is, again, that play analogy, where Act 1 is Sonic 3 and Act 2 is Sonic and Knuckles. They both have rising tensions, difficulty, and climaxes, but Sonic 3's is to a lesser extent, whereas Sonic and Knuckles, on its own, is then the more challenging game overall. One more thing to mention before wrapping up is that Sonic 3 brings back a multiplayer versus mode. However, this time around, there are 5 dedicated stages. All of these stages are races, where the goal is to finish multiple laps in a looping stage before your opponent. There are also traps you can lay out, as well as items that will both help you or potentially hinder you. Because the stages loop, that means that you and your opponent can still hinder and interact with each other, which is a nice idea, because if one player blasts ahead in a normal race, that could potentially lead to an incredibly lopsided versus battle that's no fun. That said, I don't think anything here is fantastic, and I really think the only way for this to be fun and challenging is probably if you were racing against someone who is about equal in skill level to you. It's still easy enough to lap someone who isn't, and at that point, the race is basically over. The idea of items and obstacles to hinder the opponent is a great concept, but I don't think plays out here as intended. To use an obstacle, you usually have to stop on a switch, meaning you're not moving, and you're just hoping your opponent will actually be hindered by the obstacle. Even then, it hardly affects them, and it was probably worse for the person stopping and waiting. I feel like there's the origin of a good idea here, and this could work for something really fun in a 2-player platform race, but it needed to be thought through more, with obstacles you could truly use to actually hinder your opponent in order to catch up if you're behind. Something worth noting here is that, even in Sonic 3 without Knuckles, players can choose to play as Sonic, Tails, or Knuckles, so he actually is playable, although the special jump abilities like Sonic's Insta-Shield, Tails flying, and Knuckles gliding are gone, with every character having an equal moveset. Finally, there's a time attack mode, but unlike Sonic CD, where the time attack was tied to the main stages, Sonic 3's time attack is only tied to the versus mode stages. That's a shame, because the time attack was such a good and natural concept from Sonic CD that it would have been nice to see implemented in Sonic 3. It's great that there is a time attack for players wanting to complete these multiplayer stages as fast as they can, I just think this should have been expanded. Sonic 3 on its own is an interesting one, because I can't remember the last time I only played Sonic 3 without the Knuckles attachment. It's to the point where I completely forgot about the Michael Jackson sub-boss music, because Sonic and Knuckles changes this theme to what I think of as the normal sub-boss theme. Whenever I think about Sonic 3 and Sonic and Knuckles as standalone titles, I've always thought, oh, Sonic 3 is my favorite game because it has Angel Island Zone, Hydrocity Zone, Ice Cap Zone, and Launch Base Zone, all of which I love. Carnival Night Zone was the only down point for me, but that was mainly because of the visual and musical aesthetic. But playing the game this way, it feels distinctly barren. I find myself missing the Sonic and Knuckles half, and in particular, I always absolutely loved finding and discovering the Super Emeralds of Sonic and Knuckles. Sonic and Knuckles asides though, Sonic 3's added abilities through its jump actions and shields were something I always loved, as it brought so many new ways to play the game. The levels always felt less like dedicated challenge sequence action levels to me, and more like areas I was combing through and exploring, which was something that I always enjoyed about Sonic 3 compared to Sonic's 1 and 2. Although it is notable that while Sonic 3's level design puts a higher level of emphasis on exploring, there are still very specific action sequences intended for moving from the start of the stage to the end of the stage, which is something the exploratory Sonic CD lacks. In fact, I think it's kind of interesting to look at the two games as two distinct ways to handle exploration in a Sonic game. Sonic 3 stages are still action stages that add exploratory elements, but maintain a focus on players proceeding from the start of the stage to the end of the stage. Sonic CD stages are purely based on exploration, meaning that there are less specific laid out challenges in terms of how players will get from the start of the stage to the end of the stage, because of just how much backtracking is involved with Sonic CD if you're going for destroying all of the robot generators. And I think, really, the jump actions, level design, and hidden rings are the things that truly make Sonic 3 distinct from its predecessors. I do kind of hop back and forth, and I think always have, on if Sonic 3 and Knuckles or Sonic 2 is my personal favorite Sonic game, and this level design is partially why, and so dependent on what mood I'm in from one day to the next. I think that's also because the exploration of Sonic 3 is always so enticing to me. Anytime I play, I feel like I need to get the Chaos Emeralds, whereas in Sonic 2, I don't feel that same internal urge to always have to get supersonic. While I had some mild critiques, Sonic 3 is an absolutely fantastic game. It really does feel like the Sonic team discovering what they felt like made the perfect Sonic levels and capitalizing on their now multiple years of experience and player feedback. It's a game that I've always loved and still do. That does it for Sonic 3. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. As I mentioned, this is the fourth part of my classic Sonic series, so if you haven't watched them yet, I hope you'll consider checking out the other videos. I also have a now massive series going over all of the classic Mega Man games, and just finished my video on Mega Man 9. Finally, I just recently started a series covering the Zelda games, and my next planned video as of recording this is on Zelda 2. As I've mentioned, and I'm sure many of you who stick around to the end know by now, I've been working on my own game over the past few years. It's an action platform game inspired by many of the classic games my friend and I who are making this grew up on. While we're a long ways away from completing the game, we'd love if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, Ophidian Interactive, for updates as we have them, if the game looks at all interesting to you. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Peace.